This is the Ramek Shinobi, and today I'm going to narrate what if Naruto meets Mavis Vermillion. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Now, wasting no more time, let's start the story.
It bored Mavis Vermillion. The blonde 12-year-old was seated at a table in the library, one of the few structures that still stand on the island of Tenro. Dozens and dozens of books were piled on the floor and on the table around her. Mavis was an avid reader. The books were varied. They fulfilled a wide range of functions, including entertaining, frightening, enticing, and informing. She always had books by her side, whether she wanted to laugh, cry, which she never did because fairies didn't come to crybabies, or just lose herself in a story. One of the few things she was aware of that could virtually always make her feel good was reading. The only other people she could think of were her best friend Zira and the adorable little animals that lived in Tenrujima. On other days, though, even she grew weary of reading and yearned for the thrill of something fresh and novel to occur on this remote, ancient island. Mavis was happy to have her best friend to keep her company on days like these. At least they could endure the boredom together, even if Zira couldn't always avoid it. Speaking of Zira, the girl had been unusually silent for the last 30 minutes or so. She was keeping a close eye out for any indications of the brunette's presence, and from just beyond her stronghold of books, she could hear the slightest sounds of even, deep breathing. Mavis frowned slightly. That girl. If Zira couldn't focus long enough to do a little studying, how were they ever going to meet the fairies? How long had it been? An hour? She checked the sun's position by looking out the small window and behind her. Oh no, has that much time passed already? That explains why I'm bored. Around midday, they started reading, and the sun was nearly done with its descent. With a faint screech, she pushed her chair back from the table and leapt out to put her bare feet on the cool stone floor. She stepped around the books she had accumulated on her side of the table, stretched lightly to relieve the kinks in her back, and nudged her drooling friend to wake her up. Zara's head shot up from her book pillow, and she looked around terrifiedly for a few moments before returning to her seat with a frown. The brunette frowned and said, "Mavis, how many times have I told you not to do that?" The blonde girl simply returned the modest smile, adopting her cute thinking pose, and putting her finger to the corner of her mouth. "This would be the 131st time, I believe. Unless you count wet willies as well, then it's 156. Zira simply shot her a sardonic glance in return. "And yet you continue to do it. Do you enjoy making me miserable?" Mavis appeared shocked. "Of course not," she exclaimed in a sarcastic tone. She then extended her arm to tug at the other girl's cheeks. "It's just that Zara's mean face is so cute. I can't help but want to see it as much as possible." For a minute, Zira remained silent, blushing without replying to the blonde's taunts. At last, she raised her voice. The girl's stomach rumbled loudly enough for both of them to hear her pleading. "It's getting late and we haven't eaten since lunch. Can we please go make some dinner?" Observing that Zira had become abnormally still, she trailed off. "Of course. That's why I woke you in the first place, silly. What would you like?" She muttered, "Someone's coming." Mavis looked perplexed for a moment before realizing that Zira was no longer in front of her. "What people on this island?" she asked. "Zira? Where'd you?" Her friend, who had hid behind a big bookcase, interrupted her with a wailing cry. "Wah! I haven't spoken to anybody in 6 years. What am I gonna do?" she exclaimed, failing to notice Mavis's expression, which resembled a puppy that had been kicked. With tears streaming down her cheeks, she cried, "It's like I don't even exist," before pulling herself together and putting on her most solemn expression. She then marched barefoot to the library's entrance to await their guest, saying, "Don't worry, Zira, leave it to me." After 2 anxious minutes of waiting, the heavy wooden door creaked open, revealing a tall figure wearing a thick black cloak. This was strange because the island's weather is nearly always warm. His face was hidden by a hood, and Mavis saw that despite his size, the man was incredibly light on his feet and made very little noise other than the creaking door that was now closing behind him. Mavis squinted and scrunched up her face to catch a glimpse of what exactly was underneath the hood, but the door finally closed and her eyes adjusted to the light of the candles inside. However, the man reached up with 2 calloused and tanned hands to remove the hood that blocked her view of the dubious man in front of her, so she didn't have to bother. When he did, the girl was greeted by a handsome boy who appeared to be at most 5 or 6 years her senior in Mavis's small and undoubtedly underutilized experience. She was briefly drawn in by his golden blonde hair, which was a few shades darker than her own, the whiskers on his cheeks, and the smile that seemed to split his face in two before she shook her head and went about her business. Mavis asked in what she hoped was a strong and commanding tone, "Why have you come to this island?" But the traveler's smile seemed to somehow widen even more, giving her the impression that she had failed. Nevertheless, she maintained her composure while she awaited this boy's response. He chuckled at a joke that Mavis thought she missed, saying, "Hello there, little girl. I'm looking for a guild called Red Lizard that are supposed to be on this island." "Well, at least I think it was this island. I'm not too good with directions, hee." He painted a hopeful face as he looked down at the girl and said, "I've explored more than half the island, but I can't seem to find their guild. Do you know where it is?" "Listen, mister." The boy interrupted abruptly, "Naruto." At that, Mavis raised an eyebrow. Furthermore, why in the world would she accept fish cakes from a stranger she had just met? No thank you. I was going to have stew tonight, not ramen." In an instant, the boy's entire attitude changed. The gleaming smile vanished from his face as his tall, arrogant stance sagged. He was crying for an inexplicable reason, and Mavis could practically see the storm clouds building above his head. "Isman," he muttered haltingly. "What was that, mister? I couldn't hear you." The whole thing was becoming more and more bizarre. This time, he spoke up a little to clear up the girl's confusion. "I said it's my name. Naruto. I wasn't asking if you wanted fish cakes. I was telling you what to call me. Naruto Uzumaki." Oh my goodness, that made much more sense. She assumed that if she hadn't been so preoccupied with the reason a strange man had come to their island to look for a long dead guild, she would have realized the fact right away. Mavis turned to the sobbing man. Child, and apologized, her face displaying understanding. "I'm sorry, Uzumaki-san. I didn't mean to, offend you. I was simply caught off guard by your exclamation." Naruto instantly returned to his original position after the words sank into his head, wiping away any tears and restoring his 100-watt smile. "Aw, that's okay. Misunderstandings happen, but you can just call me Naruto, so, Mavis Vermillion," was her response. His grin widened. "So Mavis Vermillion, could you give me some directions to Red Lizard? I have some very important information I need to give to their master. It seems that they're going to be attacked by another guild called Blue Skull." Mavis surmised. She assumed she was aware of his destination. Naruto was impressed and said, "Yeah, how do you know that?" To figure that out, he had to creep into a number of seedy bars. This young girl must have had a lot of good connections in order to know what was going to happen. Naruto scowled and said, "They already attacked. Was it too late for him to alert them?" Mavis went on, 6 years ago." The older of the two blondes broke the silence after they had been staring at each other for a while. He turned back to the girl in front of him, who had a puzzled look on her face. "Wha? 6 years? That's not possible, it's only been." He began counting on his fingers, 3 years at the most. Well, I think it's only been 3 years. I did sort of lose track of time on my way through Bosco. Damn. Damn. I'm too late again." Fearing the response, he inquired, "Were there any survivors?" "Just me and my friend Zira," she answered, noticing a yelp but no movement from her friend who had been kicked out. "We've been living here alone since then." When Naruto heard this, he frowned. He apologized to both the girl in front of him and the one behind the bookcase, saying, "I'm sorry I didn't get here in time to warn your guild." In an attempt to relieve him of any unwarranted guilt he might be experiencing, she said, "There's no need for you to apologize for an attack that you took no part in." "But is it your job to go around informing guilds of impending attacks?" He started to say, "Well, I mean, not really, but if I can help," but was cut off again. "Exactly. If you can help. In this case you could not, and as such, we do not blame you for losing track of time, even if it was for 6 years." Naruto smiled sorrowfully at the younger blonde. "I really am sorry I couldn't get here in time. Can I do anything to make it up to you two? Are you doing okay on this island all by yourselves? Do you need me to take you somewhere on the mainland? I mean, I don't have a boat, but I can find a way for all of us to make it. And then you can find some adults to live with, or you could join a guild and make friends." Naruto went on and on until something he said attracted the attention of Mavis. She asked with a hint of doubt, "If you don't have a boat, then how did you get here?" He said, "Huh? Oh, I just walked is all." As if walking across miles of ocean were a common occurrence. Mavis looked at the boy incredulously and said, "You walked across miles and miles of ocean, without getting wet? And how exactly did you manage to do that?" She had to stop thinking because what she was witnessing was undoubtedly not real. How on earthland could he expect us to believe? It had to be some sort of illusion. Perhaps she was experiencing hallucinations brought on by hunger. People most definitely did not stand on the ceiling, so she knew it was a fake, whatever it was. Even for someone with, of course, that was just not feasible, and that was it. "You're a mage," she exclaimed with joy. She hadn't seen a mage in a very long time. Over the years, she had learned some illusion magic on her own, but in order to create truly potent magics, teachers had to be true experts in their fields. Perhaps Naruto would teach her some of his magic if he were a mage. That would be incredible. She had been able to learn some illusion magic on her own, but the rest was just too challenging. Naruto scratched the back of his head and gave a sheepish laugh. Well, sort of. What I do is a little bit different from magic. Incredibly curious to find out more about this sort of magic, Mavis expressed confusion. What do you mean a bit different? I thought that all forms of magic were created from the same energy. If that's true, then how is your magic any different from anyone else's magic? Is it something other than holder or caster magic? Oh, is it a lost magic? Before answering, Naruto grinned at the enthusiastic reaction and gracefully landed in front of the star-struck girl after descending from the ceiling. Mavis just stared at him, not quite understanding. Well, I guess you could call it a lost magic, but even that would be a misnomer, because technically I don't use magic at all. Where to start? Okay, so I actually look really young for my age. Like really, really, really young. With me so far? He inquired. Despite her confusion, Mavis nodded. Was he older than he appeared? How much older? How was his sort of magic related to his age? She had to know more. Unaware of the questions running through Mavis' mind, Naruto carried on. Well, the place that I'm from doesn't exist anymore. It was a land filled with war and violence, corruption and trickery, and the soldiers of the land, called shinobi, carried out missions to kill, steal, and commit all sorts of horrible acts in the name of their village. They used an energy called chakra to perform jutsus, sort of like spells, in order to attack one another and also to assist in transportation. After countless wars, and even more deaths, the entire land just collapsed in on itself. Eventually, everyone who could use chakra died out and people developed the ability to use absorb eternano and use magic. Now, as far as I know, I'm the only one left in the world who can use chakra. Mavis gazed in wonder at the man in front of her. Somewhere in the many bookcases behind her, she vaguely remembered reading a book that mentioned in passing an ancient race that was capable of amazing feats, like what they call magic today. It was reported that those individuals employed energy other than eternano to manipulate the elements and even transform the energy into a tangible form for use as a weapon. Scholars generally agreed that this energy, which she now understood to be called chakra, was the ancestor of magic and eternano. The man in front of her was the last surviving artifact from a time of legends, if he was speaking the truth, which she was now pretty sure he was. However, that implied that Naruto was, well, old. Curiosity prompted her to ask, how old are you? If what you say is true, then that would mean you were at least 600 years old. But then, you talk about your people like you watched them die out, which would mean you were even older. Ah, you're pretty smart, you know that? I am indeed over 600 years old, but I'm not going to tell you exactly how old. That wouldn't be any fun. So instead, you have to guess, and if you manage to guess, I'll tell you anything you want to know about the world when I was young. Naruto laughed at the girl's response. The fact that the piece of living history in front of her would not give up such important information made Mavis look very upset. Her eyes hardened, though, and she gave a determined nod. With all the conviction she could muster, she declared, I accept your challenge. Despite appearing somewhat perplexed by her abrupt statement, Naruto shrugged and accepted it. Who was he to ruin her fun if it inspired her? At last, he made the decision to return to the original reason he had come. He turned to the door and waved, saying, so if my message is useless now, I guess I don't have a reason for staying here much longer. Unless there's anything that you or your friend need from me, I'll be off. Mavis yelled, wait, and stopped moving. You never let me guess your age. From over his shoulder, Naruto gave the girl a sheepish smile. When he saw the blonde's face, his smile turned into a smirk. Hey, I guess you're right. Okay, you get one guess. She cried, only one guess? It's near impossible to guess a person's age when they could be anywhere from 600 to well over 1,000 years old. She was taking this little game much more seriously than he was, so Naruto decided to lend her a hand a little. Alright, how about this? I am older than 650, but younger than 1,000. That should help narrow it down. And I should have specified, you get one guess today, he elaborated. Naruto had to admit that Mavis's perplexed expression was incredibly adorable. She started to pout at the idea of losing a source of such important information. 1. Today? How is that going to help? What are the chances that we'll ever meet again? If you were to leave now, then it's highly unlikely that we'll cross paths at any point in the future, which would mean that I still got one chance to guess. Furthermore, despite his peculiarity, Naruto was amiable and kind, and she wouldn't mind getting to know the elderly man better. Another friend would always be helpful to her. She could also admit to herself that he was pretty cute for a man who was several hundred years old. The aforementioned man's words startled the blonde out of her reverie. I wouldn't worry too much about that. For as long as you stay on this island, I'll stop by every few months to visit, and even if you leave here to go to the mainland, I'm always traveling and it's a small world out there. I'm sure we'll run into each other again somewhere. Besides, I don't exactly have too many friends. Being immortal, you grow tired of watching everyone you hold dear grow old and die around you. But the friends I do have mean the world to me, and I'd like to think we could be friends. And who knows? Maybe the next time I visit, Zero will come and introduce herself instead of hiding behind a bookshelf. It was a startling squeak, his final words. Naruto's hand vanished under his cloak and reappeared a few seconds later with an unusual knife that Mavis had never seen before. One last thing before I go. It had a crescent moon-shaped blade that was sharp on both sides all the way down to the base. The handle was adorned with an odd, ancient script that she had never seen before, and it was wrapped in a tan cloth. There was a tiny ring on the knife's bottom that appeared to be just big enough for Naruto to fit his finger through. She stiffened for a brief instant before realizing that the man in front of her could have hurt her at any time during their conversation, and she wouldn't have realized until it was much too late. She banished that thought from her mind and returned her focus to the knife, which was now slowly rotating around one of the shinobi's fingers. He tossed it into the air, caught the blade, and held the handle out to the shorter blonde in one fluid motion. After a moment of bewilderment, Mavis turned her gaze to the person holding the knife. With a broad smile, Naruto pushed the odd object back in the direction of the girl. Taking the hint, she took it from him and studied it more closely. Even though she wasn't an expert on blades of any kind, she could tell it was well made. The flat portion of the blade was a smooth matte black that seemed to absorb the light surrounding it, and the edge appeared incredibly sharp, as if even the slightest touch against her finger would shatter the skin. The sound of her newest friend's voice speaking to her jolted her back to reality once more. Naruto clarified, "That knife you're holding is called a kunai." Mavis simply nodded slowly, amazed at the potential of instant teleportation. "It's an important part of a technique I use that allows me to instantly relocate myself to where one of those is located. If you're ever in trouble, just throw that kunai into the floor or wall nearby and I'll be there to help." She almost lost herself in her own little world once more, but Naruto's advice to try throwing the knife as a kind of practice run diverted her attention. The young girl nodded and drew her arm back for the throw, but Naruto stopped her by taking a light hold of her wrist and moving behind her to reposition her shoulders. Mavis wound back again, flushed brightly at the close contact, stammered a thank you to the blonde boy, and then let go of the knife with all her strength in the direction of the library's thick front door. It flew a few feet off to the right and wobbled unsteadily, but before it could crash into the hard stones that made up the wall around the door, Naruto's presence behind her vanished. In the same instant, the entryway was illuminated by a bright flash of yellow light, which died down to reveal the blonde ninja smirking as he casually spun the kunai she had just thrown around his finger. Mavis stared at what she saw. Her mind was racing, replaying what she had just seen, and her mouth hung down, almost scraping the floor. Instant teleportation, that's what it was. The time that passed between his disappearance behind her and his reappearance in front of her was instantaneous. As if he had just told reality that he truly existed at both locations in space for that one instant in time, it almost felt as though he was in both locations simultaneously. It was the most amazing thing she had ever seen in her 12 years of life. However, she was left with a lot of questions after this demonstration. This power had to have a limit. What was it? Did it only function at a specific distance? Is there a limit to how many times it can be done each day? Was the user harmed in any way? How exactly did it operate? In an attempt to get answers as quickly as possible, Mavis spat out these questions one after the other. Fortunately, Naruto started explaining things before the young girl's breathing became labored. "As far as I know, there's no limit on the distance or amount of times it can be used in a set period. My dad once used this technique to fight an entire army of nearly 200 ninja in under a minute. It takes very little chakra to use, even for someone with relatively low reserves. For me, it's like a drop in the ocean. I'd probably have to use the technique continuously for close to an hour before I started to feel anything resembling fatigue. As for how it works, well, imagine that space is a piece of cloth." He grabbed a portion of his cloak and continued. He traced a line of roughly 6 inches across his cloak with his finger, saying, "Normally, when we move, it's in a straight line across the cloth. Now imagine that this kunai and my chakra are opposing ends of 2 magnets. In other words, we're drawn towards each other. The force that pulls at us is so great that it can actually bend space," he said, holding his cloak's ends together with his thumb and forefinger. In order to bring the 2 objects closer together, From there, it's just a matter of making a little hole that I can climb through to get from one side of the cloth to the other. Lastly, he inserted the kunai tip through one side of his cloak and out the other. He questioned, does that make sense? He really wanted to know. He had never before had to describe the method's operation. The majority merely accepted it. After giving it some thought, Mavis nodded in agreement. While most of Naruto's explanation made some sense to her, she was unable to determine what permitted a piece of metal to defy the most fundamental laws of reality. I think I understand. Just one more question. What is it that makes the kunai so special? She asked. Naruto smiled at how intelligent the girl was. He had wondered if she would inquire about that. The majority of people would be so preoccupied with other parts of his explanation that they would fail to notice that he wasn't the only one attempting to control time and space. He handed her the knife again, handle first, pointing out the characters scribbled along its grip with his other hand. Good question. And the answer is this bit of ink right here. Mavis examined the knife again, focusing particularly on the ink lines covering the handle. At first, she had dismissed it as mere ornamentation, possibly a name tag of some kind in the language of his people. But now she was aware of this. To get a better look, she held it up to her face and started contrasting what she saw with her knowledge of runescript. Although the grammar and syntax were completely different, there were some basic similarities between the two. Some of the characters on the knife appeared as though they might have evolved into what are now runic letters over time. Runes read like a story and had a fairly simple composition. But these symbols weren't linear in any way. They appeared to converge in a tangle of interlocking lines, swirling together from all sides. She thought that mastering the subtleties of grammar in this language would be extremely challenging yet incredibly rewarding. She turned back to the man with the whiskers and described what she had discovered. You're right about the correlation between runes and seals. From the little I know of runes, the characters are based on sealing script, but the overall organization changed to the linear style that you're familiar with. A consequence of this, though, is that you lose the ability to have a single rune influence more than the other runes in that sentence. On the other hand, with seals, the structure allows for each character to influence every other character and completely alter their intended function. As a result, something written with a dozen sealing characters would require more than 100 runes to reproduce. As Mavis started to continue what was, quite honestly, the most fascinating conversation she had ever had, a fierce growl from her stomach cut her off. She started cursing her mutinous stomach in her mind. If it meant she could carry on this insightful discussion, she would gladly go several hours without eating. In just 30 minutes, she had learned more than she would have from reading books from the library's collection for a month. It was wonderful to have another intelligent person to talk to. Although her best friend was anything but academic, she genuinely loved Zira. She started to tell Naruto to disregard the hunger pangs in her stomach, but the shinobi took advantage of the opportunity to depart. Naruto turned back to the door and said, I should get going. You girls have a dinner to eat, and I don't want to impose any more than I already have. Mavis begged the man to stay so they could continue talking, but he refused. Wait, you can have dinner with us. You don't have to leave already. I have so many more questions. Plus, it's dark out now. You shouldn't try crossing the ocean in the dark. You could get hurt. Just stay on the island for the night and you can leave tomorrow. Still looking heartbroken, the young blonde said, Don't worry, Mavis. This isn't the last time you'll see me. I'll come back to visit in a month or two, okay? She smiled a little when I said, and maybe I'll even bring some souvenirs, and responded, You better. The older blonde laughed softly. Naruto opened the heavy door and went outside, sending a final smile over his shoulder. After hiding behind the bookshelf for a while, Zira finally came out and stood beside Mavis in the doorway. Standing side by side, they watched the cloaked shinobi's back until he vanished into the darkness. As Naruto stepped onto the dry sand of Tenryujima's beach, he exhaled with relief from the roiling waters. Even though he assured Mavis and Zira that there would be no issues, he found it mentally and physically taxing to travel miles across the ocean with just his chakra. Even at the best of times, walking for hours with nothing to look at but water in every direction was tedious. The situation only gets worse when the person walking is unable to locate the legend on a map, much less his destination. Even though he could always use his handy-dandy Hiraishin, he stopped using it after learning that Mavis had started wearing the kunai as a strange and extremely dangerous necklace on his first visit to his two young friends. She nearly always carried a necklace with her, even while she was taking a bath. He didn't want to go through that again. That day, he also learned two other things. One was that Mavis and Zira took regular baths together, and the other was that both girls knew exactly which parts of a man's body hurt the most when he was hit, even though they had spent a significant amount of their early years alone. He would continue to deny it until the day he passed away, but when their attack was over, he sobbed like a baby who had just been spanked. It goes without saying that the three were sufficiently ashamed of what had happened in that creek to decide not to discuss it ever again. Aside from his disastrous first encounter with Zira, Naruto had been having a great time visiting Tenro for the past year. It had been too long since he had developed a personal attachment to anyone. That desire was severely curbed by the knowledge that everyone you knew would one day pass away while you watched helplessly. In record time, however, these girls had wormed their way into his trust. Mavis's intelligence and Zera's dry wit were very refreshing, if unexpected qualities for someone so young. He would bring the girls a trinket of some kind from wherever he had recently wandered, and they would sit around discussing everything except Naruto's house whenever he visited, which was roughly once a month. Mavis was no closer to hearing stories of a time lost to most of history after 11 guesses because she had still not reached Naruto's age. Even though she was disappointed that she was no closer to her objective, she persisted in telling the elderly shinobi that she would guess it the next time. He was thinking of simply telling her his age at this point, but the highlights of his month were the looks on her face when she was certain she had got it right. Although he avoided talking about his home, he had no qualms about his use of ninja techniques. He would be happy to demonstrate any number of jutsu he had developed or adopted over his lengthy life if asked. He longed for the girls to be able to use chakra or for him to be able to use magic so he could enroll them as students. They had repeatedly stated that they wanted to learn magic so they could protect one another, and Naruto believed that there was no greater reason to gain power than to use it to protect those you care about. He made the decision to find them a magic teacher as the first thing he would do if the two of them ever showed an interest in leaving the island. As he approached the library where Mavis and Zira would be waiting, the blonde jolted out of his reverie. Mavis had set up a number of traps for him during his last 3 trips to the island. The blonde girl had set up a veritable minefield of traps, both large and small, in an attempt to determine the ninja's most likely route from the beach to the library, testing both of their abilities. It was mostly just things to annoy him that he wouldn't be able to conceal from the would-be tactician, like slingshots filled with tiny rocks intended to cause minor bruises on his skin or foul-smelling mud placed in shallow pitfalls. Oddly enough, every trap he discovered had already been set off, creating a straight path all the way to the big stone structure. He was a little concerned about that since Zira had learned to avoid all of her best friend's traps and he should have been the only person to visit the island recently. But he knew Mavis was intelligent enough to know when she was in over her head, so he didn't freak out. She would have thrown the kunai and he would have been there to assist with whatever was happening if that had occurred. When he got to the library, he quietly opened the door in the hopes of approaching the girls covertly before leaping out to frighten them. Was it immature? Indeed. Was he concerned? Absolutely not. In order to reach the girls' favorite table, which was located in the back of the building close to the windows that looked out into the forest, he used his centuries of experience as a ninja to slip through the book rows. When he arrived at his destination, he discovered a single piece of paper with Mavis' tidy script on it instead of his 2 little friends as he had anticipated. It said, "To Naruto, in pursuit of the Tenro Jade, treasure seekers have traveled to the island. The jade was already gone, so it appears that my attempts to stop them were in vain. The only possible explanation is that it was taken by one of Blue Skull's members who survived the Red Lizard attack 7 years ago. To make sure we can retrieve what was lost, Zira and I have temporarily teamed up with the treasure seekers. More significantly, he promised to let me meet the fairies after I defeated one of the hunters in a game of wit. I'll make sure to get in touch with you through the kunai when I do meet them so you can join me in meeting them. To learn more about the Blue Skull member, we will first visit the port town of Harjin. We'll be playing it by ear after that, but you'll be able to locate us, I'm sure. I'll throw the kunai to let you know where we've ended up if we don't hear from you within a week of when you should be reading this. See you soon. I'm going to guess your age this time, so don't waste any more time. Love." Zira and Mavis. Naruto scowled as he looked at the letter's date. They had been traveling with a group of strange men for almost 3 weeks, as it appeared that they had left just a week after he had last left. That didn't sit well with him at all. He tucked the folded letter into a pocket of his cloak, turned on his heel, and strode back the way he had just come. If he wanted to catch up with the girls and their new pals, he would need to move quickly. In the interim, all he could hope was that they didn't get themselves into any trouble. He returned to the mainland in time to have dinner at one of the local eateries because he had reached Tenrujima at noon. He asked the waitress for directions to Harjin town while paying his bill. Although he had previously passed through the town, he was unaware of its exact location in relation to the town he was in. He was not supposed to be getting lost on the road of life at this point. He needed to visit his friends to check on them. There were some things in this world that no one could control, even though he might have trusted their judgment. The fact that they were making a special effort to locate a member of a guild that had utterly destroyed their own only a few years prior didn't help either. He wanted to get to them as soon as possible for those reasons. He made his way to the town's edge, hopped up into the trees, and leapt swiftly from branch to branch in the direction of Harjin, refusing to let his first two friends in hundreds of years suffer because he couldn't reach them in his course set. He arrived at the small fishing town just as the sun was starting to rise above the trees, having made good time. Regretfully, that meant he had lost another few hours of his best opportunity to obtain information. Before he could start his mission of figuring out where his two young friends had gone, the blonde would have to wait for the bars to reopen. However, he made the decision to rest and replenish his energy until then because, even for him, running through the night without sleep was very taxing. He arrived at a small bakery that had just finished baking its first loaves of bread as he walked toward the aroma of bread. After buying a fresh loaf for breakfast, Naruto headed to a more sedate area of the city to get some rest. A few hours later, he woke up to see a young boy, no more than 6, preparing to poke his face with a twisted tree branch. He glared at the young boy for his impolite awakening, which caused the child to flee back to his mother, and slapped away the offending stick. He straightened his back and neck, checked the sun's position, and concluded that it was late enough in the day for the bars to begin to fill up. He located a lone bar tucked away from the street in the parts of town closest to the docks. Fortunately for the blonde, there were a lot more people inside than he had anticipated. It indicated that a group of people, probably a guild, regularly congregated here. Naruto walked up to the bartender, who was standing there cleaning glasses and glancing over at his newest client in what he believed to be a subtle manner. Instead, it appeared as though he had a serious spinal injury due to the way he angled his head and nearly crossed his eyes in an attempt to catch a glimpse of the blonde without the man noticing. He chose to forego nuance and obtain his answers as quickly as possible because the man and, based on the glares behind him, the other patrons of the bar were already suspicious of Naruto. "I'm looking for a little blonde girl about this high," he said, bringing his hand just below his ribs, wearing a headband with what looked like little wings on the side. "Have you seen her?" The barman's expression was an odd mix of fear, anger, and hope. He waved his hand at the customers seated throughout the room, who were all nodding along contentedly, thrilled to have the opportunity to repay the impudent little girl and her blade. Wielding babysitter. "Yeah, I saw the little psycho. Bitch comes in here asking questions she shouldn't ask and then tries to kill us all when we don't have the answers. You gonna do something bad to her when you find her? If so, we'd all be happy to lend a hand." Naruto answered in an entirely neutral tone, barely able to contain a frown. He looked around the room, observing how everyone's expressions instantly soured. "Actually, that little psycho is my friend. I've been looking for her and my other friend to make sure they're all right. You all have obviously run into them, so which one of you wants to tell me where they went?" he said. Men got up, taking knives from their pockets and clubs from their backs, one table at a time, ready to attack the blonde man. With a sigh, the sage said, "You really don't want to fuck with me right now. I'm not in the mood to play games." He tried to avoid the headache by closing his eyes, but it didn't help. Before Naruto responded, the armed thugs took one menacing step forward. He spun back to the bar, grabbed the barman behind his oblong head with his right hand before most people could blink, and slammed him face first into the bar. Blood spurted from the man's broken nose, splintering wood and crunching cartilage. Naruto moved his hand to the back of the barman's shirt and pulled, heaving the bloodied man up and over the bar before he could pull himself up. Naruto's dazed and bewildered victim, facing the other patrons and serving as a human shield, wound up in front of the blonde after completing a full revolution in the air. In order to finish the move, he reached under his cloak. A moment later, his arm reappeared holding a kunai, which he then placed against the barman's throat. It took 3 seconds in total. The armed men stopped in their tracks, staring in shock at what had happened to their comrade. Fearing that the blonde, who was clearly unstable, would lose it and kill everyone, nobody moved. Naruto simply gazed at the frightened men's faces without blinking. Tension permeated the air as each man waited for the next person to speak. "Now, is someone going to tell me what I want to know?" The barman seemed to have regained consciousness after a full 30 seconds of excruciating silence, and he started to describe what had happened in a nasal voice. To get rid of the knife wielding madman, the man told his story as quickly as he could. "The girl and her friend came in looking for a guild. We didn't want to tell them nothing, so I told them to get out. We tried trapping them in a rune circle when they didn't scram, but she figured we had a rune wrong and just walked out. Then she summoned this big ass dog thing and tried to make it eat us. I told them what they wanted to know and they left. That's it, I swear," he said. The blonde simply looked back at the rest of the bar, who were staring at him expectantly. When the man appeared to have finished speaking, he asked, "And what is it that you told them?" He had indeed heard what had happened in the bar, but he was unaware of her next move. They were looking for Blue Skull. We sent him to Magnolia Town. Not like they're gonna find anything there. Place is a ghost town. Blue Skull's master keeps all the citizens under his thumb. Ain't nothing goes on in that city that he don't know about. Naruto was relieved that he could obtain this information from them in a reasonably amicable way, but he still required one more piece of information. He trailed off menacingly to observe their reactions, and he was not let down. I appreciate you're willing to share all of this with me, but there's one more thing I need you to do for me. Because of the obvious tension in the room, each thug appeared to be on the verge of passing out. With every second that went by, their cautious expressions became increasingly anxious until eventually. Which way is Magnolia from here? The impact was immediate. They all appeared astonished by how straightforward the request was. Next came the giggling, which quickly turned into full-fledged laughter before dissolving into tears of relief. In a bar full of sobbing men, Naruto and the barman were eventually the only ones standing straight. After removing his knife from the bartender's throat, Naruto turned him around and gazed expectantly. The barman fervently hoped that was sufficient to appease the insane man before him, but the man soon realized and said, "Just head straight west from here. There's a path that leads all the way to the town. You can't miss it." Hopefully, he would leave them alone after learning this. For a few moments he stared in terror at the expressionless man, but then the unimaginable occurred. He grinned, the stoic man. The fully grown barman instantly passed out because it was the most terrifying thing he had ever encountered. Naruto shrugged and turned to face the other men in the bar after observing the motionless body of the man he was going to thank with curiosity. He discovered them embracing and congratulating one another on surviving the terrifying experience. They were so engrossed in their festivities that they failed to notice that Naruto had not yet departed. The shinobi walked to the door and out into the sunlight, rolling his eyes. Some individuals were simply strange. Mavis was standing in her new guild's main room. After almost 2.5 weeks, the construction team finally finished renovating the building that the city had offered them in exchange for Blue Skull's departure, and the results of their labor were now in front of her. It was definitely hers. Even though they needed more chairs and tables, the bar was empty, and they needed to get some lacrima in here for the lights if they wanted to stay past sundown. It was her idea. Her dream brought to life all around her, but it was also Zera's, Yuri's, Warod's, Precht's, and hers. She also got to be the master because it was her idea. Fairy Tail's first master was Master Mavis Vermillion, who used fairy magic and pursued fairies. Yes, that sounded good to her. In addition to all the standard amenities one would find in a typical guild, she did notice that Naruto was still not there. However, she could fix that. Before pulling out the unique kunai Naruto had given her, she reached into the top of her dress. The fact that the intelligent girl they had gotten to know over the last few weeks had a habit of carrying a very sharp knife under her shirt left the former treasure hunters perplexed and a little alarmed. Since they had never seen it before, they could only speculate that she was either skilled at concealing it among her belongings or that she hadn't removed it in the month since they first met. What possible reason could she have for bringing it out now, when things had finally calmed down, if she had no reason to use it when they were fighting for their lives against Blue Skull and a possessed Yuri wreaking havoc as an enormous dragon skeleton? As she paced to the most open area of the guild floor, the blonde girl appeared to be a strange mix of excited and anxious. The worry vanished as she turned back to her friends and grinned broadly at them all. With a playful twinkle in her eye, she said, "Would you like to see something amazing, Yuri, Precht, Warod?" The three men exchanged cautious glances before turning to face Zera with curious expressions. Zera simply smiled, shook her head, and gestured back to Mavis. Her cryptic remarks seemed to further perplex her elders. Just let her express her inner showman. We've never gotten to be on this end before. Even I'm kind of looking forward to it. Her smile grew, but it vanished as soon as she looked back at Mavis. The reason was that Mavis was standing there idly with one hand on her hip and the other spinning the kunai around one finger by the ring, just as she had witnessed Naruto do countless times. She shouted, "Mavis!" with a reprimanding frown on her face and hands on her hips. "How many times have Naruto and I told you not to do that? You'll poke your eye out." Mavis sulked and stopped spinning the knife. She complained, "But Naruto does it all the time. It makes him look so cool. I want to look that cool." Zera, however, would not have it. Naruto has years of practice playing with ultra, sharp and dangerous knives. You, on the other hand, have no such experience, she yelled. She sighed and gave in a little when she heard someone complain, "And whose fault is that? If you can find a totally blunt kunai to practice with, I suppose you could go ahead and try. If you're going to do it anyway, you might as well be safe about it." Mavis instantly smiled and hurried to her friend, giving her a tight hug while being cautious not to stab Zera in the back with the blade. "It was... thank you," she exclaimed. "You're the best." she exclaimed, releasing her friend and spinning around a few times in a bizarre dance imitation before returning to reality and turning to face the irate group in front of her. She cleared her throat and spoke to them. As I was saying before, do you three want to see something amazing? The girl needed to calm down by now, and that was all the three older men wanted. She was excited about something they had never seen her do before. They replied in the affirmative, figuring that complying with whatever the girl was saying would calm her down more quickly than anything else. Yeah, sure, why not, if you insist. She beckoned Zira and the men to form a loose semicircle with her in the center, waving her arms in a come-hither motion. She spoke to the others with a slight smirk on her face, sharing an excited expression with her best friend. She was eager to observe their responses. There was a brief period of silence before Yuri chose to speak. Watch, she said, pulling her arm back, and be amazed. She threw the kunai with all her strength, and it flew through the air for about 6 feet before embedding itself into the wooden floor with a thunk. So, that was cool. Good throw. Mavis simply dismissed him. Just wait. He'll come any moment now. Just keep watching. She fixed her intense gaze on the kunai, not even daring to blink for fear of missing him. Everyone's focus returned to the seemingly harmless knife protruding from the recently replaced floorboards as a result. The guild door behind them opened, letting one person in before it shut once more, and there was silence. After observing them for a while, the newcomer made the decision to speak. With genuine curiosity, he asked, "What are you all doing?" It was impossible to see what they were staring at because of their crowded bodies. She informed the man, "We're waiting for our friend to appear. He should be here by now." At that statement, the traveler arched an eyebrow. If they were waiting for someone to arrive, why would they be staring at a floor? Wouldn't keeping an eye on the door make more sense? Stepping forward a few paces, he peered over the blonde girl's shoulder at the object of their fascination. Well, then that made sense. Though he disregarded it because he was already so close, he believed he had felt it only moments before. He thought about telling them he had arrived, but the whole thing was simply too good to spoil, so they sat down again to watch the knife. It took Zira almost 15 seconds before her curiosity overcame her and she made the decision to find out who had chosen to join their guild. She felt incredibly stupid and a little let down by what she saw. She had been eager to observe the expressions on the faces of the treasure seekers. Well, Mavis would have to do for her. Naruto, she exclaimed, startled. I know, what could be taking him so long? He said he'd come as soon as it was thrown, so why isn't he here yet? Mavis asked, perplexed by her fellow blonde's absence. Maybe he knows you're not in any danger, so he's ignoring what's obviously an attempt to impress some new friends. Naruto speculated. The only person still gazing at the kunai embedded in the floorboards was Mavis. The three treasure hunters exchanged a wry look after determining who the newest arrival was, while Zira covered her mouth with both hands in an attempt to contain her laughter. Or maybe, he continued, he was already nearby when you threw it and decided to take the long way here. Mavis hummed to herself. When the realization finally hit, she interrupted herself, saying, that's possible, I suppose, but if he really was that close then he should have been here already, and the only ones here are. With a joyful cry, she spun around and threw herself into the older blonde's arms. Naruto. You're here. A frown abruptly replaced her bright smile. Where were you? You were supposed to flash in and wow our new friends. Zira and I really wanted to see their faces and you just had to go and ruin it, didn't you? She saw a squinty-eyed Naruto waiting for a reply with his hands on his hips. Mavis spoke quickly, but the shinobi just stared back, unfazed. I was already in town when you threw the kunai, so I decided to just walk here. I wanted to talk to the townspeople and get an idea of what was going on before I came to meet you guys. This whole town looks like a bomb went off. He turned to address the entire group at that point. And would either of you care to explain why you went traipsing around the mainland with a group of strange men without telling me first? He asked, turning back to face Mavis and Zira. The stuff I heard in town was sort of far-fetched, so if you don't mind, can someone explain exactly what happened? Naruto attempted to sound disappointed and reproachful, but his youthful appearance and voice gave the impression that he was more irritable and betrayed. Zira asked, clearly amused by Naruto's sudden outburst of overprotectiveness, isn't everyone a strange man when you're a 13-year-old girl? She smirked at the treasure seekers and continued, and besides, these three are completely harmless. That remark infuriated all three of the young men, and Yuri started to respond, but Mavis interrupted. She clasped her hands in front of her, her eyes wide and full of unshed tears, then looked up at Naruto and spoke in her best puppy dog voice. We're really sorry, Naruto. I was going to use the kunai. But you said it was for emergencies only, and I knew Zira and I could handle ourselves if something did go wrong. And I didn't want to interrupt you in case you were doing something super important like saving the world, and you're always saying that we should go out and explore the world, so I thought it would be alright, and I really hope you're not mad at us, because if you were, I'd be so sad, and I wouldn't know what to do if you weren't my friend anymore, so please, please, please say you'll forgive us. Mavis finished her pleading pose, but she stood gasping for air as she continued her spontaneous stare off with the blonde man in front of her. The treasure seekers cast pitying glances at the girl who was gasping. The man in the cloak who faced the group appeared to be a serious businessman. Despite his youthful appearance, they could tell by the look in his eyes that this man had seen things. Things that young people shouldn't see. This was the type of man who punished rule breakers severely. However, the extent of the harshness was still unknown, so they stood with bated breath, prepared to step in on behalf of their young friend if the blonde man's actions were too severe for such a young and defenseless girl. The three treasure hunters tensed when Naruto finally moved, but instead of the harsh reprimands or perhaps even physical violence they had anticipated, the big blonde man fell to his knees in front of Mavis, threw his arms wide, and embraced the girl in a huge bear hug. Tears streamed down his face in rivers as he blabbered incoherently about not being able to stay angry at such sweet and innocent little girls. After a few pats on the wailing child's head, Mavis looked back over her shoulder at the rest of the room, letting go of her moment of surprise that her ploy had actually worked. When she saw what was waiting for her, she couldn't help but laugh. Zira stood a few feet to their left, rubbing her forehead with one hand and doing her best not to sigh in frustration at Naruto's extreme overreaction, while her three newest friends were slumped over, mouths open and eyes wide at the utterly unexpected turn of events. This scene was nearly identical to one that had taken place a few months prior, following Naruto's reprimand of the two of them for attempting to pry into his possessions. He apologized almost immediately for being too harsh on them, even though all they had done was crack slightly rebuked expressions. For Mavis, it was part of the old man's allure, but Zira suspected that the shinobi was a little cracked after being cut off from real human connection and friendship for hundreds of years. She wouldn't say that to his face, of course, for fear of drowning in the ensuing flood of tears. Naruto's manic sobbing took a good 5 minutes to stop, and when he did, his return to a composed and cool figure of authority was startlingly sudden. He regained his composure and turned to the group, his young face wearing a serious expression. Both girls appeared appropriately placated and nodded in agreement as Naruto explained his reasoning. Okay, Mavis, Zira, I apologize for my reaction. I was out of line. I'm not your father and I have no say in what you do with your lives, he started. But, as your friend, I would have appreciated a more timely warning when you decide to go gallivanting off with three strangers that you knew little to nothing about. They shouldn't have left Tenryujima without giving Naruto due notice. Since the destruction of Red Lizard 7 years ago, he was the closest thing they had to a guardian. Naruto gave them a gentle smile and made the decision to move on after observing their expressions and concluding that they had learned their lesson. After receiving a round of nods in response, he turned on his heel and walked back to the guild door. So, how about this? I don't know about you all, but I'm starving. How about we go find ourselves some lunch so I can get to know your three new friends here and you can fill me in as to what you've all been doing these past 3 weeks. Sound good? He asked. He paused in the middle of his stride, glanced over his shoulder, and said, Is there any place to actually get food around here? The town's sort of a mess. It looks like a dragon came rampaging through here. He sighed wearily as he saw the 5 people behind him wince. He was growing too old to put up with this crap. After Magnolia was nearly completely destroyed, the 6-person group soon found themselves seated in one of the few cafes that were still standing. Naruto gave the other members of the group a stern look after they had settled in and given their orders. He gestured to the treasure hunters and said, So start talking. I'm pretty sure I came through here a few years ago and the town certainly didn't look like this. Start from the beginning though, with those three's arrival on the island, and why it is you took off without telling me. The 2 young girls looked down in shame, but they forced themselves to look up as he frowned, and they took turns telling the story of how they got from Tenryujima to Magnolia. Throughout their tale, Naruto's expression did not change in the slightest. And so, to stop Yuri from destroying the town and killing anyone, I used the magic we were taught to disable him without hurting him. Mavis replied with a grin. After giving this some thought, Naruto turned to face the girl. What kind of magic allowed you to subdue a rampaging dragon skeleton so easily? Mavis clapped her hands enthusiastically and giggled. It's this amazing lost magic called law. She was extremely disappointed if she thought Naruto would be amazed by her mastery of such a sophisticated kind of magic. Rather, his whole body was tense, and his face twisted as if he had just swallowed something very bitter. Throughout his lengthy life, Naruto had only come into contact with the magic of law twice, and neither experience was likely to be forgotten. The first occurred prior to the establishment of the guild system, when mages traveled the nation and accepted jobs wherever they could. Similar to modern guilds, the weaker mages would frequently unite under a stronger, more seasoned mage for protection. Nevertheless, they would travel across the nation in big groups to wherever there was the most work, rather than settling in one city. Instead of accepting the relatively low-paying jobs offered by civilians seeking assistance, one of these groups began attacking small settlements along the Seven Fury border, stealing whatever they wanted and leaving the towns in ruins. In terms of magical prowess, most of the mages in the troop were fairly unimportant, but their leader was something else. During his travels, the deranged man had discovered the law's secrets and twisted them to fit his purposes. The leader would use his magic to instantly extinguish every life in the village. With the exception of his own followers, if the impoverished town he and his gang arrived in refused to submit to their every whim. After obtaining what they wanted, the group would proceed to their next victims, leaving behind pale, cooling corpses that littered the streets. Before Naruto discovered their work and followed them to a sizable trading outpost that straddled the borders of Fury, Bosco, and Seven, his gang of murderers and bandits carried on in this manner through 8 small towns and villages. He had no qualms about slinking into the tavern the group had acquired for the night and killing the man while he slept once he had identified the leader, which was not difficult given the absurd amount of exquisite jewelry that covered his body and the shining crown that rested atop his head. Naruto would have attempted to persuade him of the wrongness of his ways at a later date, but he had lived for too long to completely comprehend that there would always be people for whom human life was meaningless. These individuals would kill and steal as much as they wanted if left on their own. Following the passing of their most potent ally, the men immediately split up to find new allies who could protect them. But he wasn't so tired of Mavis learning it because of this encounter with the terrifying magic of law. She was a good person, and Naruto knew that she would only ever use the power her magic gave her to defend the people she cared about. No, it was his second, most recent experience with the ancient spell that caused the uneasiness to settle in his stomach. Even though the event was incredibly short, it only served to emphasize that some lost magics were lost for a reason, namely, that they were extremely dangerous to try, if not completely mastered. On one of the main roads connecting the Pergrande Kingdom and the Sin Peninsula, Naruto had the misfortune of encountering the second practitioner of law, who had been ambushing traders and travelers. When the gang of bandits decided that the young man traveling alone was an easy target, they jumped out of their hiding places to attack Naruto, who was on his way to enjoy some nice, wholesome relaxation on the beautiful beaches of Sin. The immortal caught the sloppy punch from his closest assailant without losing his stride and proceeded to swing the man around like a bullwhip, slamming his flailing legs and feet into the faces of the man turned weapons fellows. Naruto, the lone survivor and the apparent leader of the motley crew, raised an eyebrow and tossed the heaving man aside to avoid getting his favorite read only cloak dirty. Sputtering, the man staggered back a few paces and assumed a combat stance. Then he threw leaves at the former leaf ninja, of all things. The bandit soon realized that such insignificant attacks would not work against the blonde, who kept walking slowly in the direction of his assailant while making the smallest of movements to deflect what appeared to Naruto to be extremely sharp leaves. This prompted the bandit to retreat a few more hurried steps, then look up, gaze over the blonde's shoulder, and smirk triumphantly. Bewildered by his assailant's abrupt change in attitude, Naruto glanced over his shoulder to see if he had overlooked anything during the last attack. He shrugged, not seeing anything interesting, and turned back to his potential robber. But for the first time since the group of men leapt from the bushes almost a minute ago, what he saw caused him to stumble. A small, intensely glowing sphere of pure light was clasped between the man's extended hands. Naruto paused in amazement at the strangeness of it all, momentarily shocked that the average mage in front of him knew about such a potent and esoteric spell. The bandit moved to clap his hands together and kill the blonde man, taking advantage of his victim's distraction. Naruto cursed himself for being easily distracted after the bandit's movement jolted him out of his inner monologue. With his fist ready to blast the man unconscious, he kicked off toward the mage at breakneck speed. Almost immediately, he realized it would be pointless. Before Naruto could reach him, the bandit's hands would come into contact with one another. He prepared himself for the next move. Although he was unsure of the exact event, he was certain that it would not be pleasant. He was uncertain whether his presence here was genuinely permanent or if it could be extinguished by something or someone strong enough, even after all this time and all the research he had done into his immortality, if that was even what this was. He had no fear of dying at this stage of his life. After the first 2 centuries or so, the fear of time taking its toll on one's body faded. No, He was far more concerned with what would happen if he survived this. As far as he could see, the body showed no outward signs of damage from the magic of law. Their bodies appeared to simply fall to the ground where they had stood, while their souls seemed to simply rise and depart. What would happen to him if the law's magic actually attacked his soul? Any physical harm he had ever experienced had been handled without incident. Nothing could harm something as ethereal as his soul, which, as far as he could tell, refused to leave his body, despite the fact that he had been beaten, stabbed, cut up, blown up, and generally screwed up. However, what would occur if something attempted to eject his soul from his body? Would it give up and walk away without a fight? Remain strong and handle the magic's influx without any problems? Or would it continue to struggle to remain inside him as law swept in and tore it apart piece by piece until it was only a shadow of what it had been? No, Naruto was not afraid of dying at this point, but he was terrified of being sentenced to an eternal life in which he would never be able to think, act, or feel as he once did. As he closed his eyes in that last moment, a fleeting thought occurred to him. If he did die here, his heart stopped and his soul extinguished. He sincerely hoped that his corpse had gained enough momentum to smash this jerk's face when they made contact. However, things did not just stop as a flash of bright light appeared before him. He was still awake enough to notice that his muscles and eyelids were still clenched impossibly tight, that the wind was still rushing past his ears. As Naruto's fist struck the bandit's face, the sound of the wind abruptly gave way to a satisfying, meaty thwack. Before he became aware that something was lacking, he gave himself a moment to savor the gratifying sensation that went along with the sound. When his fist broke the asshole's nose, there ought to have been a loud crunch to accompany the thwack. And the thwack had not sounded like it usually did. Now that he thought about it, it was a little too damp. Speaking of moisture, the blood seeping from his fist had the wrong consistency. Naruto opened his eyes to find out what was causing all of these abnormalities, but it didn't have the sticky, slimy sensation of snot ejected from the broken sinus cavities mixed in with the thick but runny this. In all honesty, he had never seen the sight that greeted him in his more than 7 centuries of life. He was almost as fascinated and amazed by it as he was repulsed. Because even though he had heard threats to turn their enemy, typically Naruto himself, inside out numerous times, he had never witnessed anyone actually carry out those threats. Undoubtedly, it opened the immortal's eyes. Organs and muscles were exposed in the open, covered in dirt from Naruto's fist, induced trip across the ground. A nearly uniform layer of pink, fleshy flesh covered his head, which moments before had been topped with shaggy brown hair. His nose had been inverted, leaving only a thumb-sized hole that Naruto assumed was the man's nasal passage, and his eyes were unchanged aside from the loss of his eyelids. A larger hole, ringed with yellowed teeth protruding at every angle, sat beneath that one. Naruto could see the man's untrimmed beard's wiry, coarse strands bunching up with his neck's extra skin inside his mouth, gradually obstructing his airways. From the side of the bandit's chest, the immortal's eyes dangled listlessly until they settled on his still beating heart. The man drew sharp, painful breaths, and his lungs stutteringly inflated. It looked like a writhing mass of gelatinous slugs as intestines spilled on either side of him, some still sliding away. If Naruto had been anyone else, he would have thrown up everything in his stomach until nothing was left but bile. It was a terrible and gory sight. As it was, he observed the slowly dying man for a few moments, remembering this sight as a warning not to play around with things you don't understand. He retrieved a shining silver kunai from beneath his cloak slowly and knelt beside a man who had been healthy and robust but a little gaunt just moments before. Nobody should have to endure this kind of suffering. Naruto could think of a few people, but since this man wasn't a psychotic goddess or an egocentric sociopath who wanted to murder every last person on the planet, Naruto would be kind to him and end his suffering. The inverted bandit took a final rasping breath as he raised the kunai to hover over the man's head. The man tried to say one final word as the knife started to descend. With a sharp shake of his head, Naruto jolted out of his reverie and looked up to see Mavis standing in front of him, waving her hand in front of his suddenly pale face. "Naruto? Hello? Naruto? Are you in there?" he asked. In a literal flash, he was out of his chair, grabbing Mavis by the arms and raising her until her head was level with his. His gaze wandered over her small frame, looking for anything that didn't belong there. When he was unable to identify any issues, he briefly relaxed, allowing his arms to hang loosely and his shoulders to unbuckle. Abruptly, he stiffened up once more and raised Mavis to a higher position than before, bringing her straight above him. He then cocked his head and peered up the hem of her dress. There was silence for a while the 3 treasure hunters watched in wonder, trying to figure out how the cloaked blonde could walk while carrying such a massive pair of large brass balls. Zira palmed her face in embarrassment. As the blatant pedophile looked up the young girl's skirt, passers-by looked on with contempt. For a brief moment, Mavis' mouth dropped into a startled, "Oh," before her face flushed more brightly than anyone could have imagined. It didn't take long for her to scream once her flush peaked. Kya! Mavis kicked out her feet and struck Naruto's nose, snapping it with a loud crack. His grip relaxed enough for Mavis to wriggle free and fall to the ground without too much shame as his head swung back, spitting mucus and blood from his nose. "What did you do that for?" exclaimed Mavis, her face still glowing with red. Naruto yelled back, wildly pointing to his broken nose, "What you mean? What was that for? What was that for?" Mavis crossed her arms and sighed, clearly not pleased by the old man's lack of awareness. The blush that had been gradually fading returned with a vengeance as she said, "You went peeking up my dress. I'm not ready to take that step yet. We haven't even had our first date." Her words took a moment to register in her own ears. Naruto's expression changed to one of intense embarrassment as he stammered out a response to the younger blonde's statement after staring at her in bewilderment until it finally dawned on him. He half asked, half said, well that's, maybe when you're older. And have, grown up a bit." He was still an awkward mess when it came to talking about relationships despite centuries of trial and error. The rest of the small group, who had been chuckling quietly among themselves, were startled by that. In an instant, their happy and amused expressions changed to ones of concern and melancholy. They all turned to face Mavis, who had her head bent and her eyes hidden from the others by her drooping bangs. In an instant, Naruto's face changed from clumsy embarrassment to concern, and a mask of seriousness returned to cover his features. He took a moment to reflect, then asked, "What is it? Did something happen? Something went wrong when you cast law, didn't it?" Mavis's head snapped up at that. Her slightly teary eyes scanned Naruto's, searching for answers he was unable to provide. "You know about law?" she inquired, holding out hope that perhaps, just possibly, he knew how to help her, to normalize her. Seeing Naruto again made her realize that she would never have a chance with him again, even though she had assumed she had moved past it and accepted that she would remain a prepubescent girl for the rest of her life. Her hopes of getting married and starting a family with Naruto, or, worse, with anyone, were dashed by the knowledge that she would never reach adulthood, be incapable of having children, and always be viewed as nothing more than a foolish young child. She was deep in thought when Naruto's voice cut through, but she didn't hear him. "Come again?" "I said, I do," Naruto reiterated. "I've, met 2 people before who used law. The second one I met, I don't know where he learned it, but when he tried to use it, he was hurt. Badly. But since you're still standing here talking to me, you obviously got off better than he did. So why don't you tell me what happened and I'll do anything within my power to help make it better." He concluded with a reassuring smile that was only marginally impeded by the fact that dried blood still covered most of his neck and portions of his cloak. Absently, Mavis realized that he must have reset his nose during the conversation because, aside from the blood, it appeared brand new. "When I used law to stop Yuri after he got possessed by the Tenro Jade," she said, continuing despite catching a glimpse of Yuri's frown. "I knew I couldn't use it perfectly, but I thought I had enough control over it to keep it from hurting anybody." Her scowl widened. "I guess I was wrong. After I cast the spell, my body got really hot. It felt like I was burning up from the inside, and right when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the heat went away and there was this flash of freezing cold. It was the coldest thing I've ever felt, like everything inside of me was turning to ice. I don't really remember anything after that. When I woke up, the doctors told me that I'll never age beyond the point that I am now. That no matter how old I get, I'll look like this for the rest of my life." She let out a single choked cry as she finished her story, before standing up straight and forcing a smile broadly. "But that's okay," she exclaimed, trying to be as bright as she could. "If this is the price I have to pay to help my friends, then that's perfectly fine. If I had to, I would do it all over again, because if my friends can't rely on me to help when they need it, how can I rely on them?" Naruto smiled broadly at her. "That's a great sentiment to have. You remind me a lot of myself when I was young," he replied affectionately. With optimism in his voice, he added, "And about the whole not aging thing, well, it's certainly not the worst thing that could happen. I've never had someone else not age with me before. Well, at least not someone that I spend a lot of time with. It'll be a novel experience." Encouraged, Mavis went to where Naruto was still sitting on the ground and gave him a strong hug while whispering her gratitude in his ear. She hesitated for a second after letting go, then recalled how they had initially begun this conversation. She asked with half curiosity and half righteous outrage, "So why did you see fit to go peeking up my dress?" Naruto scratched the back of his head and laughed a little. He was perspiring inside, frantically trying to recall the reasoning behind his decision to look up a 12-year-old's dress. Mavis nodded and said, well y'all see. Remember that other guy that I mentioned who used law? He concluded hastily, yeah, well, he sort of turned himself inside out and died. To find out exactly what had been said, the 5 non-ninja members tried to clear their ears. After a moment, Precht spoke for the entire group. Naruto jerked and turned to face the table, seemingly forgetting that he and Mavis were not the only ones having this conversation. Could you repeat that? I think we misheard you. After swallowing, Naruto spoke again, a little more slowly this time. The group's jaws dropped and their eyes widened when I said that the last guy the first saw use law turned himself inside out after using it to try to kill me. The first to recover was Warod. When you say, inside out, you mean like... He trailed off, making hazy gestures, unsure of how to ask. He grimaced and said, yeah, like, organs flopping around like fish, muscles and fat on the outside, skin and hair on the inside. Once more, the group fell silent for a short while before Yuri summarized everything they had to say. Holy shit. He exhaled deeply. You mean that could have happened to Mavis? Mavis swallowed as Naruto gave a solemn nod. She was seriously starting to second-guess her decision to pursue magic. It didn't seem so horrible to continue being adorable, cuddly, and sweet for the rest of her life. Naruto got up and brushed off his cloak before he and Mavis went back to the table and tried to shift the topic. So, Naruto said, his still, bloodied face beaming as he turned to face the 3 treasure seekers on the other side. He pointed to Mavis and Zira and said, who are you and why shouldn't I kill you for taking these 2 away from their home, on a dangerous adventure, without telling me first? Yuri spat out his drink and Precht choked on his food, and Warod gave them both a pat on the back to stop their fits of coughing. The blonde man's smile caused all 3 of them to look startled and a little afraid. At least until Zira and Mavis decided to control the slightly insane ninja by giving him a roughly forceful slap on the back of his head. Naruto. Zira cried out sharply, her voice full of resentment. Naruto frowned and hung his snarky head, saying, you can't go around threatening to kill our friends just because you feel left out. His voice was childish as he muttered, who said it was a threat? His first close companions in over 3 centuries were Zira and Mavis. Was it really that difficult to ensure that these 2 adorable girls suffered no harm at all? He could see that if he wanted to protect them, he had to be more involved in their lives. On Tenryujima, isolated from the world's evils, they had felt sufficiently safe. They would never want to go back to dull old Tenro, though, now that they had seen the real world and all of its wonders. No matter what he said or did, they would do whatever it took to stay here. He might as well get along with their new pals as it was. Having a few male friends for the first time in a long time couldn't be harmful. He let out a sigh. He was becoming too lenient. He nodded his head and gave the 3 men an apologetic smile, saying, I'm Naruto. I apologize. It's been a while since I've had to actually talk to people and I'm still getting used to it. First to recover, Warod reached across the table to the shinobi. He sat back and waited for his friends to introduce themselves, shaking hands firmly with the blonde. Warod Sequin. Pleasure to meet you, Naruto. Next was Precht, who shook the shinobi's hand and gave him an approving glance. He shook hands and said, Precht Gabald. He made no other offer. Yuri finally gave his introduction. Yuri Drayar, King of Awesome, he said, grinning cheekily. With an inquisitive expression, Naruto reclined in his chair. He had been troubled by this ever since Mavis and Zira had reached this point in their story. So this guy that taught you all magic. Did you manage to get his name? Seems really irresponsible to teach a 12-year-old something as powerful and dangerous as law and not even explain what could go wrong with it. When they described their time in the forest learning their respective magics, they were incredibly evasive. They had been unambiguous about the fact that they were all taught by one individual. There was a man who was sufficiently skilled and knowledgeable to teach 5 people 5 different kinds of magic, including one as strong as law. The people he could think of who could do this made up a very short list, and Naruto liked to think he knew of any mage worth hearing about anywhere this side of Bellum. He fervently hoped that a very small group of people had not become so close to Zira and Mavis without his knowledge. Anticipating a response, he gazed up at the 5 of them. After a moment of contemplation, Mavis shrugged. She glanced at her friends and said, you know, I don't think I actually ever caught his name. Did any of you? She asked, raising her eyebrows in a contemplative pose after each of them shook their heads or shrugged in response. He had a black coat and a white shawl draped across his shoulder. Oh. And he had this really terrible magic that killed everything he touched. She illustrated this by placing her hand on her head and wriggling her fingers. Well, he was sort of skinny. He had black hair that sort of stuck out at the top, she concluded with a smile. With wide eyes, Naruto gazed at her, hoping he had misheard. For the man she just described was at the top of the list of people I don't want within 100 kilometers of Mavis and Zera. Dragneel Zareth. Zareth, also known as the Black Mage. Shish. T. Naruto wasn't pleased. About 300 years ago, part of his self-imposed mission as an immortal wanderer was to monitor Zareth and, if he could, control the boy when he started acting out. Given that Zareth had been sulking somewhere in the Pergrande Kingdom's east when Naruto last heard from him, the news that he was in Fury was definitely unwanted. Southeast Fury is a long, long way away. He was going to give someone in his information network a hard time. Naruto didn't even despise Zareth. In actuality, he was a gentle and kind person 80% of the time. Being immortal himself, he was one of the few people Naruto could still relate to. Occasionally, when either of them felt somewhat affable, they would seek each other out for a few weeks of human contact before withdrawing into seclusion. But the other 20% of the time, when Zareth went crazy and thought that humanity needed to be purified? The shinobi genuinely feared those times, because Zareth didn't take any shortcuts. Zareth would definitely kill shit if he so desired. Fighting Zareth, whose magic was only meant to destroy everything, was difficult enough, but attempting to control the walking natural disasters he created out of nothing and prevent them from destroying everything in their path was simply too much for one man to bear. Fortunately, in the last 300 years or so, he had only had to do this 3 times. It wasn't nearly as horrible as it could have been to spend a few months, once every century, developing sentient weapons of mass destruction and displaying them for some senseless murder. Naruto could scarcely hold the child responsible. On a couple of occasions, he had been tempted to just snap and kill everything he saw. It could be mentally taxing to live for hundreds and hundreds of years with little prolonged human interaction. The good news was that Zareth should remain composed and calm for at least another 70 or 80 years if the trend continued. That was great news because it meant that Mavis and Zera wouldn't be in danger because they would probably be dead by then. Small miracles are a blessing. Shish. T. It was a little morbid. His eyes regained focus after he shook his head vigorously to get rid of that thought, and he noticed that the 5 inexperienced wizards were staring at him strangely. Mavis questioned, "So do you know who he is then, Naruto?" She is eager to find out who she can thank for using the magic he taught her to save her friends and Magnolia as a whole. Naruto scowled. He heard gasps from all around the table when he said, "Yeah, his name's Zareth. I take it you've heard of him then?" Precht was the first to speak again. "Yes. The Black Mage Zareth. One of the most evil wizards of all time. It's said that he created countless horrors. Demons that could wipe out entire settlements with a single spell. But he was born centuries ago, there's no way that he could have been the one to teach us. The boy who taught us couldn't have been much older than us. In fact, he may have been younger." Again, Naruto shook his head. No, if he was as Mavis described, then it was definitely Zareth. He's one of the few people I can think of who would be knowledgeable enough to teach you all such varied magics. And of those few, he's the only I can think of who'd be wandering around the forests of Fury. The rest hold important positions in various governments and wouldn't have time to go on a walkabout through the forest. Precht seemed somewhat offended by the contradiction with arrogance. "What is it that makes you such an expert on a long-dead dark mage? You're what, 20, 21? Surprised that Mavis and Zera had not yet brought up his immortality, Naruto turned to look at them. He glanced at Zera, who then turned to face the 3 treasure seekers. Mavis snorted. Naruto looks young for his age, like really, really, really young. They appeared to notice that. As they thought about this, Precht and Warod had critical expressions on their faces. Yuri simply had a perplexed expression. "So you're what? Like 30? 35? Naruto grinned amusedly at Yuri. "No, not exactly. Suffice to say, that to me, Zareth is just getting out of his diapers." Warod followed by saying, "So just how old are you? The way you're talking, it's like you're hundreds of years old, but that's impossible." Naruto paused and said, But you see, it is very possible. At least, I'm pretty sure it's possible. I don't think I've dreamt up the last few centuries. But then again, it has happened before. The last time I ran into Metallicana, he punched me through 2 mountains. I was unconscious for about a week. I had some of the most vivid dreams. In one of them I was swimming in Ramen Ocean and the Ramades came up from their homes at the bottom to serenade me while they fed and be. He began to blush and cleared of his throat. The others stared at him in shock and mild concern. "Anyway, I'm sure that Zareth was the one who taught you because he's a friend of mine." "Well, sort of. Sometimes. When he's not massacring hundreds of innocent people and or bawling his eyes out at least. Naruto decided it was time to switch the topic once more because all 5 of his companions had puzzled expressions on their faces. He was primarily asking Mavis and Zira, but he thought he should also ask the treasure hunters, so, what are you gonna do now? Mavis answered on their behalf, we're going to run the guild of course. He was caught off guard by her matter-of-fact response. Huh? Eloquent as usual. Mavis responded, fairy tale, in a tone that suggested she thought he already knew this. Naruto asked, fairy tale? What's that? He was still totally lost. No, fairy tale. She corrected him as though she were speaking to someone who might not have been fully present. He reiterated, stressing the final word for some reason, okay, fairy tale. I still don't know what that is. Mavis gave him a patient glance. I've already told you, it's our guild. Sincerely curious, he asked, since when do we have a guild? Was there something so crucial that he had overlooked? His guild mark was missing. Was it beneath his clothes somewhere? It was on his ass, he hoped. That would be very funny. Since next week when the paperwork gets back from the council, he still didn't understand that, but Zira interrupted him before he could reply because she was sick of the back and forth. What Mavis means is that after we ran Blue Skull out of town, she decided that Magnolia needed a new guild to step in and protect the town so that something like this, she said as she looked at the damage, would never happen again. So we created a guild. Fairy tale. Mavis is going to be the first master. The building that you found us in is going to be the guild hall. They just got done fixing it up earlier this morning. At last, Naruto comprehended, and he was genuinely impressed. It was a good idea. In addition to Magnolia, Mavis and Zira would also be protected by a guild. After joining a new guild, mages would swarm to it and try their hardest to keep their master and fellow guild members safe. This was ideal. Here, the girls were heroes. When they had issues that were too minor to involve him, the villagers would take good care of them and offer assistance. If the need arose, he would still know where to find them because they would be stationary. Yes, he concluded. This would be perfectly acceptable. So where do I sign up? Mavis smiled. Naruto watched idly as the crimson liquid trickled languidly to the ground while staring blankly down at his blood-soaked hands. Dozens of dead bodies were spread out in the room at strange angles around him. Numerous others were still breathing, albeit with difficulty. The last would be dead in a few hours at most without help. A quick glance revealed that these men had not passed away without suffering. It was made abundantly clear by the ripped, burned, and eviscerated bodies, some of which lacked the previously mentioned head, if the horrified and agonized expressions on the faces of the deceased weren't enough. As he turned to head for the door, Naruto maintained an expressionless expression. While traveling, he walked mercilessly over a man's kidney that had fallen to the ground through a huge hole in his abdomen. The man's body stiffened and shook from the excruciating pain, and he let out a wailing scream. His scream was interrupted, and as his eyes went glassy and his heart finally died, he gave a final rasping breath. The bloodied shinobi ignored him and made their way to the guild's entrance. As he stepped outside, he noticed the hot sun shining on the clearing where the guild hall was located. The massacre inside the building stood in stark contrast to the day's brightness and beauty. Naruto continued to leave the guild until he was about 50 meters away. He turned and took a final look at the scene of all the carnage before taking a sharp sniff. Kaden. Goka Mekyaku no Jutsu. The blonde let out a thin stream of white-hot flames from the end of his hand as he brought a slightly closed fist in front of his mouth, before abruptly exploding outward to cover the entire width of the clearing, more than 100 meters at its widest point. The flames continued in a compact beam for about 20 meters. The wooden guild hall was soon on fire, and the agonized cries of the remaining guild members trapped inside broke the silence of the forest. Blood boiled in veins, flesh melted from bone, and hair and clothing were burned in the guild crematorium. Before the final screams subsided, this went on for almost 2 minutes. Still without a hint of emotion on his face, Naruto watched in silence as the guild's ruins burned and crumbled. He turned his head to see the rest of the damage he had caused inside when he could no longer hear the agonized cries of his victims. In front of his eyes, plants and animals were being reduced to ash as far back into the forest as he could see from this position. A cage Bunshin appeared beside him, thinking that he should put out the forest fire before it got too bad. As the clone heaved its creator into the sky, he stepped onto its already interlocked hands, bent his leg, and pushed. Naruto could see from his new vantage point that the fire went on for almost a kilometer after the guild hall was destroyed. He took another deep breath and looked directly down at the still, smoldering guild. Dai Bakusu Shuha is the Sweden. He let out a powerful stream of water from his stomach while pausing to develop and mold the chakra inside of him. With crushing force, millions of gallons of water poured down, flattening everything in its path. For 30 seconds, Naruto's mouth continued to spew out the enormous flood until the waterline was above the tallest of the flaming trees. The blonde used the control he had developed over centuries of practice to form the mass of water into a huge sphere that was clearly visible from the nearest town, which was almost 20 kilometers away. Naruto landed on top and peered down into his makeshift aquarium, where he could barely see the remaining fragments of the guild. A splintered table, several charred planks, and what appeared to be half of a human skull. It was insufficient. Nothing could be left. A tiny black sphere materialized in the palm of his hand, and his bandaged right arm glowed golden. After admiring the powerful ball of chakra for a brief moment, he threw it directly into the water bubble beneath him and leapt away. He turned around to see what transpired after he had moved to what he considered to be a safe distance from the enormous bubble. Show little Bijudama. After reaching 2/3 of the way down the bubble, the black sphere of ultra compressed chakra abruptly grew to 6 times its original size before collapsing into a pinprick of blackness. After a brief period of rippling, the water sphere lost cohesiveness, imploded, and erupted upward, leaving only a crater where, just moments earlier, acres of forest had flourished. Naruto lifted his right leg and brought the attached foot crashing back down to the ground, deciding that his task was finally finished. Daichidukaku, said Doden. The enormous crater started to invert itself almost immediately, as though a giant was standing underneath it and pushing it flat again. The shinobi prepared his last jutsu after the crater had realigned with the surroundings. Jukai Kuden. Mokoden Hajutsu. His chakra pulsed, causing the ground to burst around him and hundreds of trees to emerge from the ground. Coiling and twisting like writhing serpents, they grew at a dizzying rate, only ceasing to grow until they were equal in height to the surrounding forest. As he watched his work, Naruto noticed that the once desolate clearing was now blended in with the surrounding forest. He gave himself a sharp nod, turned on his heel, took 3 steps, and vanished in a golden flash. The Guild of Grey Sparrow had vanished, an hour prior to the demise of Grey Sparrow. Only as a rest stop for travelers from Gallows Town to Matza Valley, Naruto trudged through the streets of Dawn City on the west coast of Fury. But the blonde wasn't here to take a break. He wasn't going to reach Matza Valley. No, he had no idea where his quarry was, but it was much closer to Dawn City. Mavis had assured him that her job had been in this city, and Naruto was certain of it. And he was positive that Grey Sparrow was the only guild in the area for miles. He had discovered this from a trembling shopkeeper before the man passed out from the extreme strain of the shinobi's bloodlust. Since no one in the town seemed to be willing to reveal the guild's precise location, the only thing left to do was find out. It was difficult to determine whether the townspeople were more frightened by the ruthless guild that preyed on their lack of security or the odd blonde who appeared poised to kill the next person to look in his direction. Fortunately, the terrified civilians were deprived of their choice before anything too horrible could occur. Naruto noticed that the already quiet crowd in the marketplace had become quiet. He glanced at the source of the silence and nearly grinned when he discovered what he was searching for. 3 men in their early 20s to mid-30s stood at the other end of the marketplace. Their matching tattoos, which were prominently displayed on their bodies, one on a man's cheek, another on a muscular right forearm, and the final one on a shirtless man's chest, were what distinguished them from the others. A bird's cruel, sharpened beak appeared excessively large in relation to its small head, and its sharp, angular wings flared up as though it were in mid-flight. A Grey Sparrow mage's mark. Naruto's bloodlust intensified as a result of an outburst of rage, becoming almost palpable all around him. His loved ones were so terrified that they blacked out as they watched their death unfold before them like a movie. It was something they had never experienced before and would never experience again. To conceal their fright and trembling, the Grey Sparrow mages glared at the intimidating presence and tensed at the awful sensation, but they were far enough away from its source to push it away. When the marketplace suddenly cleared, those who could bear the pressure grabbed the less fortunate and hurried back to their homes to escape whatever was about to happen. Ignoring the townspeople who were running away, Naruto strode resolutely toward the 3 guild members, pausing less than a foot from the face of the tallest. The man with the tattoo on his forearm was the shinobi's target. He stood about 3 inches taller than the 6-foot tall Naruto and a good 6 inches taller than his fellow countrymen. Scars ran up and down his muscled arm, and one of them split his guild mark in half down the middle, giving the impression that the sparrow's wings had been cut off where they emerged from its back. He had a full goatee of coarse black hair, but his head was shaved. From his left eyebrow to the middle of his head, he had a single, large scar that ran raggedly. If you weren't Naruto, He appeared to be a very intimidating figure overall. Ignoring his allies because they were irrelevant to his present plans, the blonde just gazed calmly into the taller man's eyes. The bald man took a moment to get used to the presence of the cloaked man, and then he sneered at the reckless blonde who had the audacity to enter his personal space. As his two companions shifted to either side of the man in the cloak, he asked the shinobi, "Fuck do you want, kid?" Without even acknowledging the movements of the other two, Naruto simply kept his gaze fixed on the taller man. At last, he decided to speak. It was more of a statement than a question. "You're in Gray Sparrow." Naruto went on, "You are going to show me to your guild," after receiving a scoff and a nod of approval. The blonde child's foolishness made the sparrows laugh. He believed he could simply approach them and give them instructions. Was he not aware of the person he was speaking to? The strongest guild west of Crocus was Gray Sparrow. This child thought he could just walk up to them and make demands when no one could touch them. As though. Before speaking, the bald-headed man bent down until he was face to face with Naruto. "And what makes you think that we're gonna take you anywhere, punk?" Naruto changed what he had said, blinking at the man's miserable breath. "You misunderstand. You will be taking me to your guild. Your friends won't be going anywhere." The tall man stepped back to show the height difference between the two and said, "And why is it that you think my buddies won't be going anywhere, huh?" Naruto's expression changed for the first time that day, going from blank to a soulless smile that didn't seem to belong on his face at all. He looked down at the mage in front of him, and while his lips quirked up at the corners, the rest of his face did not even twitch. After a tense 15 seconds of silence, the blonde finally spoke. "Dead men don't move very far." It only took a few moments for the sparrows to become distracted by the deadpan delivery. Naruto quickly extended his arms to either side while holding a kunai in each hand. They swiftly gained traction in the throats of the smaller sparrows, where they remained for a brief moment before being violently ripped from the sides of their necks in a torrent of arterial blood. After continuing their journey, the knives eventually found a new home, this time fitting neatly into the bald sparrow's shoulder joints. With the exception of the two smaller mages' blood flowing in waves from their throats and the three mages' disbelieving expressions, everything was motionless for a brief moment. When the throatless mages fell backwards and hit the ground, lifeless, the moment was over. The bald mage screamed in agony and horror at the crumpling bodies, gaping foolishly at his now useless arms hanging limply at his sides. After waiting for the man's scream to fade into stunned silence, Naruto grabbed his kunai, applied a layer of extremely sharp wind chakra, and ripped downward, severing the mage's scarred arms cleanly from the rest of his body. Not unlike a Chidori's first step, Naruto rapidly accumulated a mass of fire, natured chakra in his palms and cupped them over the deformed area, instantly cauterizing the wounds and stopping him from bleeding to death. Naruto slapped the man across the face to keep him from going into shock when he noticed that his eyes were starting to roll into his head. It appeared to be effective because the man's eyes became somewhat clear again and he looked at the ninja in horror. Naruto reminded the man of his original motivation as he saw his coherence return. He paused and thought about what he had said. "So," he said calmly, as though he hadn't just killed two men and left another man permanently disfigured. "You were going to point me in the direction of your guild, were you not?" He shrugged and gestured slightly down at the sparrow's missing limbs, emphasizing, "Well, I suppose you won't be doing much pointing in the near future, will you?" He sounded dismissive and returned his attention to the mage. Naturally, that was not going to happen. "Just nod your head in the direction your guild is in and you'll be free to go. If you move quick enough, you might be able to get some fully working prosthetics attached before your nerves atrophy and become useless." By cauterizing the wounds and burning away any connective tissue that might serve as a base for the prosthetic to attach to, Naruto had taken care of that. However, such information was unnecessary for dead men to know. The mage, who had by now collapsed to his knees from the agony, gazed at Naruto in terror for a while before opening his mouth to speak. He tilted his head in the general direction he described, saying, "S is southeast. T towards the M mountain." In the distance, it was possible to see the peak of a snow-capped mountain peeking above the trees. Unprompted, he added, "FIF. 15k kilometers that way." Naruto looked down at the stammering mess of a man, attempting to verify the veracity of his statements. He took the sparrow at his word because he could see the fear and defeat in the man's eyes and concluded that there was no reason for him to lie now. He made no more noise as he tightened his hold on the kunai in his right hand and drove it into the man's forehead. The skewered man's expression briefly showed shock before he relaxed and fell to the ground in a heap after the knife was removed from his head. 3 Kage Bunshin materialized around him as he thought. "Clean this up. No sense traumatizing these people more than we already have," he commanded, pointing to the rows of buildings where dozens of pairs of eyes were visible through closed curtains. The three clones nodded to their creator and went to work, while the third used a small Sweden jutsu to wash away the puddles of blood that had gathered along the cobbled street. The other two gathered the bodies and brought them outside of town before burning them to ash. In the meantime, the real Naruto raced toward the far-off mountain and, most likely, the Grey Sparrow Guild. After 10 minutes of running, Naruto caught a glimpse of a tall wooden building through a tree gap. As he entered the clearing, he looked up to see the emblem, the same one that had been tattooed on the men he had just killed, seated atop the building. Excellent, he had located it. The blonde walked slowly toward the big double doors that adorned the guild's front. Naruto entered the guild without hesitation, stepping just inside the doorway before pushing the oaken doors open. The guild members sneered at the boyish newcomer, and suddenly the noises in the hall stopped. A mage at the table nearest the door said, "Da fuck do you want, kid? You can't just come bargain in here like you own the place." The man who spoke was called over by a brunette woman seated a few tables away. A few other women seated around her table giggled and said, "Oh, don't be like that, Blaine. Cuties like him are always welcome here. Us girls get tired of staring at your ugly mug day in and day out, ya know." Naruto just stared around the crowded guild hall, ignoring the byplay. The open space was scattered with large round tables, all of which were occupied by gruff-looking men and women who, before he arrived, appeared to be drinking and laughing at each other's tales. He knew they all had the Grey Sparrow's mark on their bodies, even though he couldn't see them all. Furthermore, they were guilty by association even if they didn't. For him, that was sufficient. "Which one of you killed her?" The mages around him stared at him in confusion. He got an answer from someone in the room's back corner. He laughed in what he perceived as a menacing tone, saying, "We kill a lot of people around here, buddy. You're gonna have to be more specific." A few others also laughed. The response didn't seem to deter Naruto. He just shifted his piercing eyes to the man who spoke and went into further detail. One person responded to the statement, "Last night. The fairy tale mage doing the job in Dawn City." There was a loud guffaw from a short, stocky man seated at a table in the middle of the room. Before the man could blink, he discovered the handle of a blade protruding from his throat. "Bawahahaha. She was a fun one, squealed like a stuck pig she did. Hootin' and hollerin' and cryin' out, D. Don't kill me. Please, I'll do anything. Gahaha.ac." He gurgled and spat blood from his mouth as his eyes grew wide and he flailed his arms wildly. When he turned to face Blonde again, he saw him toss a perfect replica of the knife in his neck into the air. He was gazing at the blonde's cloak, just inches from his face, when there was a flash of yellow. The skewered man and the ninja were standing by the doors, precisely where the cloaked man had been only moments before, after another confusing flash. Naruto swung the bleeding mage around to confront the other members of his guild after catching the spinning kunai out of the air. His fellow wizards were yelling, getting up from their chairs and getting ready to strike the intruder who was holding their friend captive. However, a rough voice called out from behind them before they could launch their attack. An older man, perhaps in his 60s, came forward from behind the bar in the back of the hall and said, "Enough. Shut up, will you?" As he looked at his guild members, his bushy mustache twitched wildly and his shoulder-length gray hair hung limp from his thinning scalp. His beady black eyes turned to the shinobi, and he raised his hands in a placatory gesture while grinning amiably at the man. Now, no need to be hasty here. I can see that you're angry, but surely there's no need to resort to violence. Daichi there was only doing his job when he killed that girl. You can understand that, can't you? Everyone's got to make a living somehow. It's hardly our fault that someone somewhere wanted her dead now, is it?" The cold raging in Naruto's gut was only heightened by the man's blasé dismissal of his friend's murder, but he was unable to take immediate action. First, he needed answers. "You say someone put in a request to kill her. Who? Why her specifically?" Naruto thought the gray-haired man was the master, but he simply laughed. No, not her specifically. The request was just for one dead fairy tale mage to be left in a high traffic area where people would see them. The little girlie just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. As for who placed the request, we dunno. Some guy came in last week wearing a cloak, sorta like yours, but with a hood up. Couldn't see his face. Just walked right in, tacked the request to the board over there, and turned and left. Didn't say a word and was only here for 15 seconds tops. We weren't gonna take it at first cause how suspicious it was. Thought it could have been a trap, ya know. Council trying to catch us up to no good and all that. But the pay was too good to pass up. 3 million jewels for one dead mage. Didn't even have to be a strong one, just anyone dumb enough to go walking around with a fairy tale stamp in plain sight. When Naruto realized this, he sighed. So you're all useless then. The master appeared insulted. Hey now, you listen here boy. I've been kind so far, letting you waltz on in here and attack my men without provocation. I've even given you answers to the questions you had about your little friend's death, so keep that slippery little tongue to yourself. Besides, Daichi there looks dead on his feet, and if you think one little meat shield is gonna keep us from killing you, well, you're dead wrong. At the conclusion of his remarks, the master's scowl had turned into an evil grin. Now boys and girls, go on and show our friend here why you don't fuck with Gray SP. Naruto yelled, wait, to temporarily halt the mage's charge. What is it boy? You want to beg for your life? We're not gonna let you go now that you gone and killed one of our own. We don't take kindly to that. Naruto gave the master a shake of his head. He took the knife that wasn't embedded in Daichi's neck, stabbed him in the abdomen, pulled it out in a single, smooth motion, and simultaneously freed the other kunai. No, it's not that. I just wanted to check something first. For a brief moment, Daichi and his guildmates gazed down at his intestines as they emerged from the gash in his stomach and collected at his feet. Abruptly, he screamed in terror and gurgled, staggered forward, slipped on his unnecessary entrails, and fell to the ground, where he lay motionless. Naruto put the bloody kunai back under his cloak and shrugged, saying, huh. He shook his head, admitting, I just don't see it. The young man who had just killed one of the master's mages left him staring. He nearly dreaded the response as he said, What? Just don't see what? Suddenly, he had second thoughts about wanting to have sex with this guy. With a nearly disappointed expression on his face, Naruto nudged the pile of cooling flesh with his foot while gazing at the master. Daichi here said it was funny that my friend squealed like a stuck pig when he killed her. I just wanted to see what I was missing out on, but I didn't see what was so funny about it. He turned his attention to the rest of the group. Did you all think it was funny? His inquisitive expression would have seemed real if not for the sparkle in his eyes, which conveyed a sense of restrained rage. Without waiting for a response, he abruptly changed the topic. I don't really enjoy killing. To be honest, I hate it. In fact, I usually go out of my way to avoid killing my enemies, but the last few hours have put me in a very, very bad mood. So today, I'm going to make an exception. Today, I'm going to kill all of you. Your deaths are going to be extremely painful. I'm not killing you to send a message though. No, quite the opposite actually. No one is going to know that you've died. In fact, no one will know that you were ever alive to begin with. I'm going to erase every shred of evidence that Gray Sparrow ever existed. And then, when I'm done here, I'm going to do the same to every other guild who received a job request similar to yours. I'm telling you this because, before you die, I want you all to realize just how big of a mistake you made by fucking with Fairy Tail. And, more importantly, by thinking you could attack me and mine without severe repercussions. Then he launched an attack. He turned to his left, facing the nearest table, and unleashed a scything wind blade at a slight angle in the direction of the 5 mages. Their bodies were neatly cut at different places along their torsos, and the sudden and swift movements left the poor men with no choice but to scream. The rest of the guild awoke from their daze and started to fight back after witnessing their comrades being killed. The long-range fighters attacked first, hurling numerous spells at the motionless sage. Naruto ducked beneath a slow-moving fireball, avoided an earthen spire that burst through the floorboards, and used his wind-encased fist to bat away a lightning bolt that streaked into an unfortunate mage to his right. With the earth mage, he pointed the lightning chakra he had collected in his right hand at the table. Chidori Senbon. The men fell to the ground in twitching, bleeding heaps as thousands of volts sporadically discharged in their systems as hundreds of incredibly thin needles shot out at the clumped-up mages, digging into and then through the pliable flesh. As the more physically oriented mages launched a mass attack, he ignored their cries of pain and returned his attention to the battle. The first mage threw a strong punch at Naruto when she was around 10 feet away. He was mildly amused as he saw her arm extend forward without a bone. The blonde just grabbed the enclosing fist with his left hand and pulled hard, knocking the woman off her feet and sending her flying toward Naruto with wide eyes. With his right hand clenched into a fist, the sage struck the woman in the jaw, shattering it and sending blood and teeth flying. Before she could pursue them, Naruto pulled her still. Caught fist once more. When she was close enough, he delivered a roundhouse kick to her stomach, causing her fist to fly out and splinter the wood as she collided with the guild's wall. 2 men with swords lunged from either side of him, giving him no time to recover and forcing him to retreat. He brought 2 swirling Rasengans down on their backs as they went by in front of him, grinding their innards to mush and snapping their spines. Another fireball and a small, swift mage appeared next. Naruto quickly put out the fireball with a huge globe of water, clipping the wide-eyed speedster behind it on his arm. 3 mages charged at him, aiming high, middle, and low in an attempt to surprise him, and he retreated once more. He just jumped over them all and sent a strong blast of air from his feet, flattening the 3 mages to the ground and then launching himself to the ceiling, where he hung upside down, shattering their hopes. Naruto dispersed the long-range attackers by sending a scorching ball of flames into their midst before they could move, setting some of the slower ones on fire. He took out several kunai from under his cloak and threw them randomly into the throng. A few of the men made fun of the blonde for his seeming incapacity when none of them managed to hit any of the mages. As Naruto Hirishin ed to each kunai, infused it with wind chakra, and then swung indiscriminately at anything in his path, those who had been laughing at the man's poor aim suddenly found themselves without limbs. He took a moment to look at his work thus far after being pulled out of the group of mages who had been dismembered by one last Hirishin. About half of the guild's mages had already been rendered incapacitated or completely destroyed by him, and many of the surviving fighters appeared reluctant to engage in combat. He would go to them, all right. Beside him, a lone Kage Bunshin materialized and gave a bear hug to the first mage he encountered. A rhythm. A ball of flames burst from the clone. The Bunshin Daibakuha tore limbs from people who were too close to the explosion and turned its immediate victim into a fine mist. Breaking through the smoke from the attack, Naruto threw a Rasengan into one man's face before spinning on his heel, hardening his skin with a swift Domu, and sending a fist through the next mage's ribcage. When they stopped to reload, he dropped the man's body, which he had used as a makeshift shield to protect himself from a barrage of magic gunshots. After strangling the terrified gunman with a chakra pulse that caused tree roots to burst from the ground, he turned to face his remaining adversaries. They appeared to be assembling for a single, massive attempt to overwhelm him. If they believed that a dozen average mages combining their strength would be sufficient to stop him, they were either very brave or very stupid. A tiny, sharp spear of wood blasted out of his palm as he thrust his arm forward. It burrowed into one man's stomach, grew quickly in multiple directions, and erupted in a shower of gore from numerous locations throughout his body. In an attempt to buy some time, the remaining mages quickly retreated. They swiftly collected their magic and released their spells as once they were at a distance they believed would protect them from the majority of his ranged attacks. With a diameter greater than Naruto's height, the twisted unison raid charged at him like a cylinder of unadulterated magic. Naruto summoned 2 Rasen Shuriken of different natures, one in each hand, without even blinking at the incredibly destructive wave of energy that was directly aimed at him. He cocked his arm back and threw the Rasen Shuriken at the approaching energy beam. The beam was dispersed into numerous smaller blasts that erupted in all directions as it effortlessly carved its way through the mass of light. When it got to the mages, who had stopped to admire the powerful spell they had accidentally created, it exploded in a torrent of molten lava, engulfing the group of mages, who instantly started howling in pain. After a few seconds of their cries, Naruto threw the Rasen Shuriken in his left hand. When it got to them, the water's razor sharp edge cut through the mage's thick layer of lava, followed by the mages themselves. Then, the entire structure collapsed, spilling hundreds of gallons of water into the surrounding area. The dismembered and dying mages were sealed into tombs of volcanic stone by the lava's almost instant hardening due to the water's cool temperature. Naruto saw something strange just as he turned to go outside to finish up. The ninja was not at all surprised by the fact that he couldn't recall killing the guild master with whom he had been conversing. When the chips were down, the slimy old man hardly seemed to be the kind to stick around and defend his friends. Since he couldn't have gone very far, Naruto looked around the destroyed guild hall in an attempt to find out where he was. The immortal man turned and walked slowly to the partially collapsed bar against the rear wall after spotting the building's only remaining viable hiding spot. He did, in fact, see the wrinkly man curled in the fetal position, breathing as quietly as he could, when he reached the counter and peered over. The master glanced up into the bloodied face of the man who had just massacred his entire guild after hearing the creak of the floor. In a desperate attempt to gain freedom, the man transformed into a shapeless cloud of smoke and hurried past the blonde, heading for the guild's doors with a frightened shout. A compressed ball of wind that rushed through his form and decompressed into omnidirectional gale force winds buffeted it, forcing the smoke into every corner of the guild hall, summarily denying him. Suddenly, the expanding winds ceased, and what could only be a miniature black hole took their place. It gathered his scattered body into a densely packed ball, carrying some of the closest corpses and severed limbs with it. The master pulled himself together and pushed desperately to get out of the void behind him, so as not to be buried beneath his dead subordinates. Following a fierce battle that used up the majority of his strength, he was able to break free and fall awkwardly into Naruto's right hand's waiting embrace. The tiny tornado, which was just now starting to taper off, didn't seem to affect the ninja at all. The blonde appeared to have done nothing at all physically demanding since he woke up that morning, aside from the blood that covered his entire body from head to toe. Reaching eye level, Naruto grabbed the shorter guild master by the neck. Your entire guild just died fighting while you cowered behind the bar doing absolutely nothing. They may have been a bunch of child murdering assholes, but at least they had the guts to go down fighting instead of turning into a bunch of sniveling pussies and giving up like you did. The guild master spat at the blonde's bloody face in retaliation. After a few moments of unwaveringly staring at the elderly man, Naruto shrugged. His loogie landed exactly in the center of the master's forehead as he spat back at him. Naruto's spit, however, started to pop and sizzle with a high-pitched hissing sound, in contrast to the master's. The acidic chakra of the former Rokubi was infused into Naruto's spit, which gradually started to eat away at the man's creased forehead skin and bone. The master could only kick and flail helplessly at the formidable ninja while the blonde's hand crushed his windpipe, screaming silently as the acid seeped into his brain. Naruto dropped his body to the ground and once again gazed at the devastation he had caused when the master finally went limp. He shook his head and sighed wearily. This was an error. He had believed that killing these people would somehow make his pain go away and give him a sense of justice by preventing the people who killed her from killing anyone else. However, it only made him feel empty. He was ultimately no better than these people because he had allowed his anger to control him. Even worse, he had a dozen or so other things he ought to be doing at the moment. He ought to be at home, with his family, at Fairy Tail. Right now, they needed him. They needed someone to help them get through this difficult period. Someone who has dealt with death before. However, they might have been better off without him present if this was his notion of a healthy response to a loved one passing away. No, that was irrelevant. He ought to support them. For her. Later, there would be time to look into this. It was time to figure out how, in just 2 months since its founding, Fairy Tail had attracted enough attention for someone to target their mages. However, his family came first for the time being. The entire situation was chaotic. They had to clean it up. He turned to leave the building after glancing down at the blood on his hands. 24 hours prior to the destroying Grey Sparrow, Naruto was genuinely happy with his life for the first time in centuries. He had not discovered a place he could genuinely call home since the dissolution of the ninja villages some 800 years ago. That is, until now. Fairy Tail was rapidly turning into the best thing that had happened to him in a long time. After learning of Blue Skull's defeat, a few wandering mages were already recruited by the 6 of them. Their curiosity had led them directly to Fairy Tail, where they were immediately captivated by Mavis's vivacious personality and natural warmth. An increasing number of requests were being fulfilled in record time, and their employers were praising them for their excellent work. Naruto had even taken a few jobs at Mavis's request and in response to Yuri and Warad's constant taunting. He hadn't completed a task assigned to him by someone other than himself in a very long time. For the old man, it was very sentimental. Even though nostalgia could be enjoyable, he only had time for 1 or 2 missions a month because he had other obligations. Now that he considered it, it was almost time for him to return to the guild to see how things were going and to make sure the raucous mages hadn't set the place on fire. Well, how can I return now? He could hear Ishin to any of the dozen or so markers he had in and around the guild and be back in Magnolia in 3 seconds, or he could take a nice, leisurely walk to see the sights and return in about 3 days. One of the Hiraishin Kanai he had left at the guild for an emergency tugged at the back of his head before he could think any more. The next instant, he flashed away after patting himself down to make sure he had everything he needed. As soon as he entered a hallway he knew to be off the guild's main floor, he realized something wasn't right. First of all, there was a conspicuous lack of the Fairy Tail mages' raucous laughter and joyous yelling. What was most telling was the fact that 3 men with pale faces were hovering in front of Mavis's office. Yuri's hand was poised as though he had been knocking, quite insistently, judging by the redness of his knuckles, and his head was leaning against the door. Warad appeared completely defeated and hopeless as he sat hunched over on the ground. With his arms folded across his chest and his brow furrowed, Precht was leaning coolly against the wall. However, he appeared to be deep in thought, as his lone eye gazed bleakly at the ground. Since Precht was the only one who looked up at the blonde's arrival, Naruto assumed that he was the one who signaled. Naruto asked the man with one eye, "What's going on, Precht? Why did you call me?" His mind was not at all calmed by the ruined looks on the faces of the 3 men. "She's gone and locked herself in there after we got the call from the Rune Knights. She won't let any of us in and I'm worried she'll do something stupid if we don't get in there. She's put up a load of runes in front of the door and windows that we don't know how to bypass. You're the only one I know who can, and we figured you'd be the best choice to calm her down right now." Naruto's anxiety only increased after hearing Precht's explanation. Naruto nodded to the man and reached for the marker he knew would be in the office. He vanished in a flash of gold after discovering it. There was absolute chaos in the office. The books and papers on top of the overturned desk were strewn all over the place. The contents of the bookshelf were scattered all over the floor after it was broken in two. A flag with the fairy tale crest was half ripped and hanging from its place on the wall, and glass trinkets were broken. A tiny blonde girl sat curled in a corner amid all the devastation. Without pausing, she let out deep, agonizing sobs and clenched her fists in her hair as though she were attempting to rip it out. Naruto arrived at this scene, standing shoulder to shoulder with the distraught girl. Without delay, he knelt down and gave her a reassuring embrace. Clinging desperately to the immortal, she answered without hesitation. After raising Mavis and moving around a little until his back was against the wall, he placed her in his lap and started to stroke her hair. Until he calmed her down enough to speak clearly, she held on to his cloak like a vice. While her face was still buried in his chest, he whispered into her hair, "Tell me what's wrong, Mavis. I can't do anything to help you if you don't tell me the problem. Tell me what it is and I'll go fix it, I swear." She started crying again, and she did so for a few more minutes. At last, she muttered something unintelligible into Naruto's chest. He drew her head out from under his cloak and raised her chin so he could see her face. "Say that again, Mavis. I can't hear you." But he was frightened by what he saw. Her eyes appeared lifeless. It appeared as though she had never experienced happiness and would never experience it again. It was the expression of someone who had given up on life and all hope. Mavis gritted her teeth and looked directly into her best friend's eyes. The Rune Knights called on the communication Lacrima. "Zera is dead." Naruto broke. Soon after Zera's passing, war broke out. Fury suffered death and devastation as a result of the Second Trade War. Every day, soldiers fought and lost their lives, and the invading forces advanced deeper and deeper into Fury. The council eventually gave in and asked mages to fight on their behalf after 2 years of fruitless back and forth. Mages seized the opportunity. Most people's resources had been depleted by the war, and the average person could no longer afford to hire mages on a regular basis. Many mages wanted to put an end to the conflict and restore employment within their guilds. Others were just eager to engage in combat. For all her youth and inexperience, Mavis proved to be a tactical genius in the 2 years of magical warfare that followed, leading the mages of Fury to incredible victories against all odds. Her perpetually innocent face caused a lot of issues, not for the first time. It took a long series of terrible defeats before she was finally given an opportunity to prove herself because older and more seasoned generals were reluctant to follow the advice of a small child. However, she wasn't the only one who established herself. During the 2 years of the war, the 3 former treasure hunters mastered their chosen magics to remarkable degrees. Precht could waltz through the devastation left behind, using his chain and bullet magics to take down anyone still standing. Yuri could use his lightning magic to turn those forests into electrified death traps, and Warod could use his green magic to transform burned and desolate battlefields into lush forests. Together, the 3 of them formed an incredibly powerful team that was worth as much as any number of Rune Knight platoons the council could deploy to engage in combat. Naruto had actually created a number of false identities for himself, giving each one a unique element and using his henge liberally. He would then show up at battles that the enemy appeared certain to win and decimate their ranks until the enemy camp was completely destroyed. Because of how easily he defeated a whole platoon of nearly 200 ninja, Minato Namikaze had been praised as one of the planet's strongest beings for almost 1,000 years prior to this. His son was now doing the same thing every day. To be honest, it frightened the council nearly as much as their adversary. Abruptly, over a dozen men and women who had never been known before emerged from the woodwork, exhibiting expertise and proficiency in their field that was uncommon even among the 10 wizard saints. Where were these individuals hiding? Who had instructed them? When sent to the battlefield, even their current number 1, Kartikeya Kumaran, an absolute monster of a man, encountered at least token opposition. Even Kumaran, whose command over fire was so great that he could create autonomous beings made entirely of the element, would find it difficult to keep up with these strangers' abilities, according to reports. After mages were brought in to defend their nation, 2 more years went by. During that period, Yuri met Rita, a stunning battlefield medic, and they quickly fell in love. Naruto's personas would serve as the foundation for boogeymen for generations to come, and Mavis, Yuri, Precht, and Warod had all solidified their status as some of the most potent mages in Fury. All of Yuri's friends attended the beautiful ceremony where he and Rita were married. Furthermore, it appeared that the fighting would soon come to an end, which would only increase the fun. The Second Trade War had been declared over just one day after they were married. No side was any closer to achieving their objectives than they had been 4 years prior, so it was unclear why the war ended at that point. The chairman of the council would say, "There are no winners in war, only survivors." The questioning would then cease. After that, time flew by. Naruto continued to spend more and more time in Magnolia. Mavis's peaceful ideals and kind disposition clashed with the fact that she had sent countless men and women to their deaths during the war, leaving her in a state of mental purgatory. There were others besides her. Despite appearances, Naruto was aware that Yuri, Warod, and, to a lesser degree, Precht were all dealing with the reality that they had killed men and women just because they were born in the wrong nation. However, they were managing. In an attempt to learn more about magic and, in his own words, find something to stop the violence and bloodshed. Surely in the annals of time, there has been some form of magic capable of bringing peace. Naruto wanted to tell him that there wasn't, but Yuri found comfort in Rita, Warod in using his green magic to create life, and Precht in poring over magical books. That during the nearly 1,000 years he had lived, there had never been any real peace. However, he didn't. This was his vice, and everyone needed something to distract them from the war. Naruto discovered that he and Mavis found comfort in one another. Mavis had lost her oldest and most cherished friend with Zera's passing. Once more, Naruto had allowed people into his heart, only to have them cruelly ripped out in an instant. They were both very reluctant to let go of each other. Even though Mavis knew that Naruto was practically unkillable, she still worried that someone had found a way to kill him. In contrast, Naruto was aware that Mavis was functionally immortal, though he was unsure to what degree she was aware of this at this time. Could she endure being beheaded, stabbed, and crushed like he did? Or had she just been impervious to time? He had no desire to learn. After 6 more years, everything had returned to normal. It was becoming more difficult for Naruto to forget that Mavis was now a young woman, if not physically. This was especially true when Mavis started using her illusion magic to appear older when she was by herself with him. The innuendo and flirtatious advances she inserted into conversations with him demonstrated that, despite her stunted physical growth, her mental development was proceeding without any problems. After almost a year of intermittent counseling sessions, Mavis was finally able to resume her public responsibilities with the same mindset she had prior to Zera and the war. Even then, she had only developed into a skilled liar. Guilt still weighed heavily on her mind, and she continued to have nightmares about death and destruction. However, she was gradually improving, and after 6 years of unceasing comfort and company from both Naruto and the entire fairy tale, she had at last regained some of the innocent wonder she had experienced prior to the conflict, Zera, and everything else. As a result, Naruto felt it was time to take up his responsibilities that he had neglected in favor of healing Mavis after she was, in a sense, back on her feet. He decided it was time to visit his contacts, so he took Hirishine to a cozy little hideout in Midi and traveled northeast to Pergrande Kingdom, stopping only as needed to re-establish contact with his information network. He had intended to zigzag through Iceberg, Stella, Bosco, Seven, and Fury on his way southwest from there. Not to be, but planned. He had a ton of information for him when he got there because his informant in Pergrande Kingdom had apparently taken Naruto's prolonged absence as a slight to his ability to gather information. The hooded man told him almost immediately after he was seated, Zerif's been making moves over in Alakatasia. The uncultured idiots over there have no idea who the hell Zerif is, and so he's been moving around unaccosted for half a decade now. My guy over there tells me he's creating an army. It's still in its infancy, but left unchecked, it could pose a serious problem in the future. He's got quite the silver tongue, it seems. Been feeding the sheep a load of shit about peace and harmony, and strength through unity. He grumbled. It'd be hilarious if it weren't actually working. Naruto frowned as he took in this information. If it gets him out of our hair, I don't see the problem. Let him play his little games over there. It'll keep him busy, and the less free time he has, the better off everyone will be. Unless he starts making those damn Aetherius again, I'm gonna consider it a low priority. He looked at his informant. He isn't making more Aetherius, is he? The man in the hood gave a quick shake of his head. Not that I've heard. Last I checked, he gave up after that bastard Mardgeir blew up that island south of Ensaw trying, and failing, to kill him. Still not sure what happened to him and his little friends though. How the fuck do a bunch of big-ass demons hide anyway? After Naruto did not respond, the man sighed. But getting back on track, you should give it a bit more of your attention. They may be a bunch of backward-ass hicks out west, but they've got some strong mages. I'd bet if you pooled the lot of them together, they'd be enough to give you a good kick in the teeth. And that seems to be exactly what Zarif's doing. He's already assimilated 2 smaller guilds into his base of operations, and there looks to be more on the way. Just give it a look when you get the chance, yeah? The last thing I need is a bunch of fanatics storming into Ishgar guns. Blazing and killing anyone who looks at them wrong. Bad for business, ya know. He grinned. The shinobi nodded once and returned the weary sigh. Yeah, I get it. I'll check in on them soon. I've been meaning to have a chat with Mr. Tall, Dark and Deadly for a while now. Anything word on those assassination requests? The man gave a headshake. Sorry, I've got nothing. Not a single whisper anywhere that I've got ears. I think it's time you just forget about it, to be honest. 4 years without any moves on their part is a sign. Whatever it is they wanted, they either got it when they killed your friend, or they got scared and gave up after Grey Sparrow went dark. Either way, there's nothing you can do about it now. Glancing back at his informant, Naruto crossed his arms over his chest and scowled thoughtfully. Even if they got what they want, I still want to know what it was. They weren't after Zira, the request was for anyone from the guild. Hell, they could have been trying to eliminate the entire guild given the number of requests that went out to the different guilds. I never actually got the exact number, didn't need to. Sparrow's disappearance and a few roughed-up mages from the more prominent guilds put them off trying anything after Zira. But if their aim was to take out the entire guild, they won't give up that easily. Get your government contacts to search the records for guilds that were targeted in a similar fashion. It may be some guild out to eliminate the competition. If it is, they'll have left a trail. Now, do you have anything else for me? Oh yeah, I almost forgot the most important part. The main reason you can't just leave Zarif over in Alakatasia to do as he pleases. He's not in Alakatasia. Naruto narrowed his eyes at his informant and sat up a little more straight. Explain. He set all the groundwork and gathered a few advisors, I guess you'd call them. They're the ones who've been doing most of the recruiting. Zarif just pops in every once in a while to give a speech or show his face to the crowds, and then he's gone again. My guy there says he's seen Zarif maybe 4 times in the last 5 years, and those were scripted public appearances. Apparently when he's not doing those he's traveling. With a hint of trepidation, Naruto questioned, so he's in Ishgar now? Naruto was certain that he would be free of Zarif for the ensuing decades based on the way his informant had been speaking. It should realize that he isn't that fortunate. Yep. Someone saw him not 2 days ago in 7, heading south by the looks of it. Oh no, Fury is south of 7. The location of Magnolia is Fury. Magnolia is home to Fairy Tail. Fairy Tail is where Mavis is. Mavis was the target of Zarif. It was the kind of rational conclusion that could only be reached by a very protective, slightly insane person. However, Naruto was a perfect fit for both of those requirements. Leaping from his seat, he slammed several jewels onto the table. The blonde spun and strode out the door of the dingy bar after saying, I've got to go. Contact me if you hear anything else about the Western continent. I'll let you know when I plan on taking a trip over there so you can tell your guy where to meet me. In an instant, he turned into the closest alleyway and vanished. His first Hiraishin led him to a kunai hidden in a rarely used room in the guild's basement. When he was unable to locate Mavis kunai within the building, he extended his senses outside. There, she was in the forests between Magnolia and Akane Beach, roughly 10 miles away. He leapt to where she was without pausing. He arrived at a scene straight out of his worst nightmare. Mavis sat next to Zarif, chatting merrily like old friends, even though she was completely unharmed. The two carried on talking without noticing his arrival. And he's going to be a father soon, exclaimed Mavis, grinning at the man with dark hair beside her. Zarif laughed and shook his head. That boy's going to be a father. That's a scary thought. On behalf of her friend, Mavis pouted. He's hardly a boy any longer. It's been 10 years since you've seen us. He's nearly 30, he's ancient. Naruto decided to interrupt their conversation at that precise moment. He pointed to Zarif and said, if Yuri is ancient, then what does that make him? Or me for that matter. When she heard his voice, Mavis gasped and whirled around. Naruto, she exclaimed as she leapt into his arms and let him spin her around once before getting back up. With wide eyes and curiosity, she said, I thought you weren't going to be back for another week. Naruto attempted to smile at her, but it came out more like a grimace. Yeah, well, I heard some things that worried me, so I wanted to come home and check on you and the others. Mavis nodded sympathetically at him, then jumped a little when she realized where she was. Oh Naruto, she said, gesturing to the mage who was still seated. This is Zarif. You said you knew each other, right? She asked, glancing between the two men as she waited for them to embrace and talk about the good old days. When elderly men reunited after a long absence, they did that, didn't they? Zarif. Naruto nodded firmly while maintaining a neutral expression. Zarif cast a sidelong glance at the sole surviving member of his senior class. With a calm smile, he asked, Naruto. It's nice to see you again. How long has it been? Not long enough. Why are you here? I was just wandering through when I happened across Mavis here. We were just catching up on things. I was terribly sorry to hear about Zera's passing. Though she neglected to mention that you and she were friends. Naruto only gave the man a lethal stare. Mavis glanced between the two, becoming increasingly perplexed. She asked both of them, I thought you said that you two were friends? But she was staring directly at Naruto. Zarif smiled sweetly at the girl. It would be quite strange if the only two immortals in the world weren't at the very least cordial with one another, would it not? And yes, at some times, we are in fact quite friendly with each other. This is where he stopped. He changed the subject here, saying, though it seems that now is not one of those times. He trailed off and shot Naruto a serious glance before saying, though, speaking of immortals. The ninja nodded slightly in acknowledgement of the unasked question. And how did that come about? That would be your doing. Zarif's smile vanished for the first time since the shinobi arrived, to be replaced by a puzzled and slightly alarmed expression. With curiosity, he inquired, how so? Law. Mavis gasped and Zarif's expression changed to one of surprise. Their little byplay suddenly made a lot more sense. They were discussing her. She lived forever. However, how? When they both nodded, she let out a ragged breath and sank to the ground. I'm immortal. I can't die? She asked, looking to them for confirmation. Zarif watched the two, and Naruto was at her side instantly. She looked at Naruto pleadingly, hoping he had the answers. How is this possible? The doctors only said that I would stop aging physically. Not that I would live forever. What about physical injuries? Would they be able to kill me? She asked. He shrugged uncomfortably. I'm not sure. I suspected the immortality thing for a while now, but I couldn't be sure as to the extent of it and I didn't want to go testing its limits, you know. What if I was wrong and you got seriously hurt? I wouldn't be able to live with myself. Once more, Zarif spoke. She is truly immortal. Nothing can kill her. She will forever be a part of this earth, just as you and I are Naruto. Naruto questioned the black mage, how do you know that? He replied, she is immortal for the same reason I am. He pointed airily at Mavis's tiny figure curled against Naruto's chest and said, she tampered with black magic beyond her comprehension and this is the result. Naruto gave a headshake. If that were true, she would have been cursed like you as well. I've been with her for a large part of the last 10 years. If it had begun to manifest itself, I would have noticed, he countered. It is called the curse of contradiction for a reason, is it not? The more one values human life, the more they kill. To the younger immortal, Mavis screamed, you're saying I don't think life is precious. Zarif gave the deeply offended girl a shake of his head. Not necessarily. All I am saying is that up till now, you have not yet understood the value of human life. It is entirely understandable. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a large war quite recently, was there not? Both of the others nodded, and you played quite a large role in that war if the stories are to be believed. Mavis replied once more, and before that Zero was killed, yes? A smile. You see, the last 10 years of your life have been rife with death and destruction. You were not truly happy with life and so the curse saw no reason to manifest. But if, as you said, you are beginning to love and see the value of others, the curse will activate and you will begin to kill those around you indiscriminately. Mavis buried her face in Naruto's chest after gasping. Then, recalling what she had just heard, she scurried away from them both until she backed herself into a tree. Zarif just stared while Naruto gave her a pathetic glance. Zarif assured her, you have no need to fear harming Naruto. If he could be harmed by the curse then he would have been dead many, many years ago. In fact, he is probably the only person with whom you would be safe spending time with, and that is including myself. I have no clue as to what would happen should our curses choose to activate when we are within each other's vicinities. It makes quite the interesting thought experiment, he thought. What happens when two contradictions try to contradict each other? Quite the riddle to solve. Mavis crawled back to curl into Naruto's chest as he gave him another paralyzing glare. He smiled reassuringly at the girl in his lap as he looked down at her. There's no need to worry about the curse, Mavis. I've been working on something off and on for the last century or so. It should be able to suppress the curse, and when it does, you'll be free to do as you please without the fear of hurting others hanging over your head. Zarif looked surprised, and Mavis's eyes were wide as she looked up at him. Curious, the girl said, if you have something that can stop the curse, then why haven't you given it to Zarif? Zarif responded on behalf of the blonde, because he does not trust me. He believes that whatever method he has devised to counteract the curse can be corrupted or mutated into something far more sinister than the curse itself. Thus he is reticent to bestow such a gift upon me. Mavis glanced to Naruto for approval, and the man nodded slowly. Zarif went on in the meantime. In any event, I would not be interested in such a cure anyway. The curse is a part of me. It defines who I am and I do not wish to change it. Besides, I have my own cure of sorts. I am playing what I suppose you could call a strategy game on the Western continent. I'm building an entire country from scratch. It is quite fun actually. Lately I've started to consolidate my forces and build up industry. The best part is, no one over there is human in my eyes, only pawns for me to control, and so the curse sees no reason to activate. He had a pleased and somewhat arrogant expression on his face as he finished. The Dark Mage's admission caused Mavis to look a little horrified. Considering people to be pawns? What sort of life was that? To think that she had been having a pleasant conversation with this monster just a short while ago. But hold on. In a few hundred years, would that be her? Would she consider herself superior to mere mortals? Would she grow so conceited and cynical that managing a whole nation and its citizens turned into a game? No, Naruto was gentle, kind, and considerate, and he had been around for at least twice as long as Zarif. She wouldn't make the same decision that Zarif made to become who he is today. She would try to be more like Naruto, albeit perhaps a little less neurotic. She heard Naruto laugh without humor, which put an end to her inner thoughts. You've either gotten extremely arrogant or extremely careless in the last few decades if you're going to admit all of that right to my face, he stated to the Dark Mage. There was no risk in me telling you this information. Unless you've been completely negligent in your duties as you like to call them, then you've surely already come across these facts from someone in your circle of informants. Besides, there is little you can do to stop my game short of crossing the ocean and murdering every last one of my subjects. But you wouldn't do that. It goes against everything you believe in. So please don't delude yourself into thinking you hold any form of power over me. We are as close to equals as possible. Zarif laughed at the two fairies. He turned and waved over his shoulder as he left the clearing, saying, "It seems I've outstayed my welcome, so I'll leave you two to your own devices. I'm sure we'll see each other again, so farewell for now you two." Before the man could go too far, Naruto called out to him. "I'm gonna give you one warning, Zarif. Leave Fury. If I find you anywhere in this country, and especially anywhere near Fairy Tail, I'll lock you in a cage at the bottom of the ocean and see how long it takes for the bars to rust over. Don't push me." Zarif simply laughed and dismissed the warning with a wave. He vanished into the thickets of the forest after saying, "Of course, Naruto. I can tell when I'm not wanted. I truly do hope you can suppress Mavis' curse, for her sake, if not your own." Mavis looked up at Naruto when she was certain he had left, confusion and worry fighting for dominance on her face. How can someone be like him? He was so kind at first, and then when you showed up, it's like a switch was flipped somewhere and he became this horrible person. It was almost like he was two separate people. Is it because of the curse of Anksuram? Am I going to end up like him? I don't want to be like him. He kills and controls people and calls it a game. He's insane. She almost started crying by the end of her tirade, but Naruto calmly ran his hand through her long blonde hair, and she gradually calmed down. First of all, you'll never be like Zarif. You're too kind, hearted, caring, and loyal to ever be remotely similar to him. Second, he may like to blame the curse for his psychosis, but I'm almost certain he was always that way, even before he acquired the curse. The whole reason he's cursed in the first place was because he was delving into black magic in an attempt to bring his dead brother back to life. While it may be a noble cause, attempted necromancy isn't exactly the hallmark of a sane individual. And third, you have something that Zarif never had. With hope, Mavis asked, "What's that?" Naruto smiled at her with all of his brightness. "Me. I'll be there whenever you need me. If you ever think that you're going insane, I'll always be around to tell you how wrong you are." Mavis appeared to be about to explode with joy. She tried to give the shinobi a full embrace by putting her arms around his wide chest. And then she felt a surge of energy come from within. Blood trickled steadily from Naruto's ears, eyes, and nose as he jerked back as though he had been hit. Little forest animals fell dead where they stood, trees lost their leaves, and grass withered and died all around them. When Mavis opened her eyes, the scene before her made her scream. She pushed herself up quickly from her bleeding friend and started shaking his shoulders. As she continued, her pleas grew softer and more desperate. "Naruto, Naruto, please, wake up Naruto. You can't do this, you said you'd be okay. Please Naruto, I can't do this without you. You can't leave me here. Wake up. I'm begging you." She was so upset that she missed the slight stirring of the man beneath her. When Naruto started to moan and raised a hand to stroke his pounding temples, she finally realized what was happening. "Naruto!" she exclaimed with relief and joy, embracing him once more. Naruto winced in agony as she backed away from her voice. He mumbled to anyone listening and said to the girl clinging to his neck, "Ah, can we tone it down a bit, Mavis? I've got a massive headache." She took a few steps back out of obligation and wiped her eyes to get rid of the tears. "Naruto. I killed you. You were dead there for a minute. You're bleeding from every hole on your face. I killed you and I didn't even feel it happening. I can't go back to the guild now. I'd be putting everyone there in danger." Naruto got up and moved toward the scared girl, scowling when she retreated from his approach. "Mavis," he murmured. "You didn't kill me. I can't die, remember? It was more like I was just unconscious for a bit while my brain stopped hemorrhaging. That curse is dangerous, but I've already told you that I can fix it. Now come on, I know a place we can go where the curse won't be able to hurt anyone while I contain it." He extended his hand to the younger blonde and she tentatively took it. They vanished in an instant after he kissed the top of her head and drew her into a tight embrace. When they reached their destination, they each stood back and surveyed the area. Naruto was not let down when he turned to see Mavis's response. She gasped and covered her mouth with her hands while gazing at the structure before her. There is no better place for Naruto to take her. The place reminded me of so many good times spent laughing, joking, and sharing stories with Zira and Naruto. Considering that they had left more than 10 years ago and had not returned, everything was in remarkably good condition. When Mavis finally made it back to Tenryujima, she was ecstatic. Mavis asked her best friend, "Naruto, it seems like it hasn't aged a bit since we left. How?" Naruto scratched the back of his head and smiled in embarrassment. Well, I've been coming back here a few times a year to keep the place in shape. You know, just in case you ever wanted to come back, I wanted you and Zira to have a home to come back to." At those words, Mavis smiled at him sadly. The thought of her deceased friend temporarily distracted her from her current problems. "Thank you, Naruto. I appreciate it more than you could ever know, and I'm sure that Zira would have loved it too. I wish you'd told me about it before. I would have insisted we bury Zira here. Fairy Tale and Magnolia was her home, but this place was ours. For 6 years it was just the two of us to keep each other company. She may be buried in Magnolia, but that doesn't mean we can't make a memorial for her here. I think she would like that." At his words, Mavis smiled brightly. That seemed like a really good idea. However, they had some priorities to attend to. Knowing it was probably not a spell, she turned to the shinobi and asked, "So how are you going to stop the curse from affecting everything around me? Is it some kind of magic ritual or one of your shinobi techniques?" Even though he knew almost everything there was to know about mage and shinobi life, he was still incapable of casting his own spells. But for good reason, he never let that get to him. Even though his methods might not have been as varied as some of the more obscure magics, his sheer strength and skill more than made up for it. He was incredibly powerful even without magic. Furthermore, not even she was aware of his full potential. He might have had many talents that he just never felt the need or desire to display. As a result, she was clueless about how he would assist her. "I've told you about Fuinjutsu, right?" he inquired. She was fairly certain she remembered him telling her and Zira about it at some point many years ago. "Isn't that the precursor to modern rune magic?" she asked. She fingered the kunai on a chain around her neck and said, "It's what's on your kunai that allows you to use your Hiraishin, right? You're correct on both accounts, although Fuinjutsu can accomplish far more than runes could ever hope to. I'll be using a seal I developed in order to combat Zerif, to seal away any chance of the black magic asserting itself. It's a bit hard to explain the mechanics of it, but essentially, it draws the tainted magic held in a person's magic container to a different part of the body where it will become trapped inside a space-time barrier that will basically create a small pocket dimension inside your body. That dimension will exist outside of our space and time, so in essence, the magic will be both within and without your body at the same time. Does that make any sense?" Noticed that it was unclear, contradictory, but he hoped she understood. "Have faith that it will work." For a brief while, Mavis's expression twisted into one of intense focus and thoughtfulness. Then she responded, "So it's like using requip on part of my own magic?" The succinct synopsis of his rather drawn-out explanation startled Naruto, but he soon recovered. Yeah, actually, that's pretty much exactly what it's doing. There are a few downsides to this though. One is that the seal will constantly be drawing on a portion of your magic. I'm not sure how much exactly, but there's a possibility that it could significantly limit your ability to use most of your fairy magics." He stopped and watched as Mavis thought about that for a while. She nodded resolutely, as if she had reached a decision. She was willing to give up some of her magical abilities in exchange for the opportunity to live her life without having to worry about killing someone she loved. He went on to the second disadvantage after observing that she was accepting of the first. The second is more of an assumption than an actual fact. I'm not sure exactly how much space magic takes up, nor am I sure of how big the pocket dimension will be. It could be infinite or it could be as small as this island. There's really no way to know. Because of this, there's a chance that the magic being siphoned off could become ultra concentrated in the pocket space and explode without warning. He observed that Mavis was beginning and rushed to calm her down. To counter that, I've designed a release valve of sorts. When we're worried that the magic is becoming too concentrated, I can activate it and all of the magic that had been stored will come out in one burst. When it gets to that time, I can take you here or some other place where we run no risk of hurting anybody. By now, Mavis had a worried expression. So it's not actually a cure? I'll still have to worry about the magic escaping at the wrong time and hurting everyone around me. And what about you? You're just going to wait around for me to reach critical mass and then whisk me away and get your brain turned to mush by the curse of Anksurum. I can't let you do that. What kind of life is that? Naruto retorted, I could think of worse ways to spend my time, and besides, it could take years to fill the pocket space completely. As long as the seal stays intact on your body, it should be completely safe for you to live a normal life and continue most of your duties as guild master. Mavis's expression remained uncertain. She interrupted herself and shot Naruto a terrified glance. It's not that I don't believe you or trust you to make perfectly functioning seal, it's just that if something goes wrong people will pay for it with their lives. I don't back up. I can feel it this time. Naruto briefly appeared shocked, but he soon recovered and leapt back to what he believed to be a safe distance. Just a moment later, a spherical burst of energy erupted from Mavis' body, destroying every plant within 15 meters of it. More tears filled Mavis's eyes as she sank wearily to the ground when it subsided. With a resolute look on his face, Naruto strode forward, lifted off the ground, and embraced him. He walked into the house and waited for a response, looking down at the young woman in his arms. We're doing this whether you want to or not, Mavis. I promise you it will get better. Just give the seal a chance. If you're worried about its effectiveness, then how about this? We'll stay here on Tenryujima until the seal fills to capacity or a year passes, whichever comes first. That way we'll have a definite time frame for when we should release the pent-up magic. She responded with a feeble nod and buried herself deeper in his embrace, seeking solace. Mavis was not surprised to discover her old room in the same state as when she and Zira had departed the island. It assumed that Naruto would keep her room tidy for her if he had taken the initiative to maintain the exterior. Naruto placed his hand on her cheek and moved the hair that had fallen into her face before laying her on the bed. Uncertain whether the girl would feel comfortable stripping in front of him, he said, I have to draw the seal directly onto your skin, so I'm going to have to take off your dress. Do you have a bathing suit or something you can wear that will give me access to your stomach? Mavis snorted a little. She scowled slightly and said, I'm 23 years old, Naruto, I don't care if you see my breasts. She muttered to herself, not that there's much to see anyway. Naruto heard, but he decided to disregard the final sentence. He attempted to explain to the girl, I just didn't want you to be uncomfortable is all. The guild master sighed in frustration. Naruto, if there is one person in the world that I would be comfortable with seeing me naked, it would be you. So stop acting like I'm some innocent and pure little child. I'm a grown woman, with grown woman wants and desires, she yelled, her face turning red. Raising an eyebrow, Naruto skillfully concealed his own blush. He asked cheekily, desires? With a sigh, Mavis sat up, pulled her dress up over her head, and threw it on the ground, leaving only her panties and her kunai necklace. She arched an eyebrow and crossed her arms beneath her tiny chest, asking him in silence what he would do next. Naruto's eyes darted from her face to his chest and back again, then he cleared his throat and let out a loud sniff. This time, he couldn't help but blush. He smiled slightly when she agreed, then unsealed a small brush and vial of ink. Ahem. Yeah, well, we should get started. Go ahead and lay back and we should have this done in no time. He began by placing his materials on the stand beside the bed. Mavis chuckled as the brush touched her stomach and started drawing the seal's outline. The sensations made her twitch a little, but she eventually remained motionless so Naruto could work, and he worked. Nothing, not even his subject's naked state, could divert him once he started writing. It was as if he had entered a different universe. Mavis observed him at work with reverence. His expertise and understanding were genuinely admirable and worthy of respect. He was in such a beautiful state that she could watch him for hours on end. Unfortunately, he finished his work in just 30 minutes, and when he did, Various characters and squiggles filled the space between the ink lines that extended from her hip bones to just below the slight swell of her breasts. He leaned back to evaluate his work after finishing the final line. He looked at the girl herself, finding it to be as close to perfection as he could get. He discovered that she was staring back at him with a gentle smile on her cherubic face. "You're amazing to watch while you work, did you know that?" she said to him in a voice that was hardly audible above a whisper. Her lavish compliments made Naruto blush, and he smiled back at her and thanked her before becoming serious. "I don't want to lie to you, Mavis, this next part will probably be extremely painful. The seal is going to forcibly tear part of your magic from you, and it won't be gradual. It'll come all at once, last for a few seconds at the most, and then fade. It's probably going to leave you exhausted for a while, so I'll send a clone back to the guild to tell everyone you won't be around for a bit. Does that all sound okay?" Mavis responded with a slightly shaky nod. He hovered his hand over her belly button, where the seal's center was located. "Ready?" he inquired. She said in a tiny voice, "Hold my hand please." Naruto could tell she was afraid, but she was trying her hardest to hide it. With his free hand ready to press the seal, he took her hand in his own. Her words caught his attention again, and he nodded in agreement as she said, "Tell Precht that he's to be acting master while I'm gone." He instructed her to take a deep breath and let it out slowly. He gave her a single squeeze and turned on the seal after she had followed his instructions. Abruptly, pain. All she knew, and would ever know, was pain. It was icy cold and searing heat, piercing and sharp. Her organs seemed to be exploding and her very blood was being purged from her veins. Her muscles repeatedly appeared to rip apart and then sew themselves back together. She felt as though a horde of dragons were using her as a trampoline due to the extreme pressure inside her chest. She almost folded herself in two as her back arched off the bed. The calming presence of Naruto's hand in her own was all the comfort she could find. As the torture went on, it served as her anchor, preventing her from drifting off into oblivion. And as abruptly as it had begun, it came to a halt, and she fell in a heap on the bed. Sweat trickled off her in sheets, and her breathing was labored. Her throat was raw from the screams, and her hair was tousled and matted. She struggled to keep her eyes open, but she was losing the fight quickly. To get closer to Naruto, she pulled on his hand adamantly. Without a word, he simply sat down beside her on the bed and used a hand towel he got from somewhere to dab at her perspiring forehead. She muttered, "Come here." Even that tiny sound made the excruciating pain in her throat worse. He followed her instructions and leaned in to listen to what she had to say. Using her remaining energy, she lifted her head and gave him a quick, tender kiss before returning to the bed and slipping into blissful unconsciousness. He shook himself out of his surprise after staring at her prone form for a brief moment. He lifted her slender frame and slipped her under the covers, making sure she was well covered to shield what little modesty she still had. He was always the gentleman. A clone appeared beside him a moment later and nodded in understanding. He understood his purpose. Before his creator shooed him away, the clone gave the unconscious girl a seductive glance, and the clone flashed off. When the clone reached his destination, he surveyed Mavis's office, making sure to return to Tenryujima with some of her most valuable belongings. As he left the office, he was startled to hear a baby's wailing in addition to the boisterous cheering that is typically heard in the guild hall. Rita appeared to have given birth at last. He made his way to the spot where a bed was leaning against the wall in the crowded room. On the bed, Rita was flushed and sweaty, but she was beaming broadly at everything, especially her husband, who was holding a newborn baby in a bundle of blankets. The sight of the contented family made the clone smile broadly. His message was crucial, but he wished he didn't have to interrupt them. He moved forward and touched Yuri's shoulder. Careful not to squash the priceless new life between them, the younger blonde turned around and embraced the clone with one arm. It was Naruto, he cried. "You're here. You haven't happened to see Mavis, have you? She left last week for an adventure, as she called it, and we haven't heard from her since she left. The paperwork is piling up in her office." "Oh," he was shaken. "Meet little Makarov. He's all of 20 minutes old. We were trying to get a hold of Mavis so we could ask her to be his godmother, but like I said, we can't find her." The Naruto clone congratulated the happy man with a smile that quickly turned into a tiny frown. To ensure that only Yuri could hear him, he leaned closer. He took a step back, shrugged apologetically, and turned to return to the office he had entered. "I really hate to do this, but I need to tear you away from your son for a few minutes. If you could grab Warod and Precht and meet me in Mavis' office, we can talk in there." Yuri returned Lil Makarov to Rita and kissed her forehead after noticing the solemn expression in Naruto's eyes. He straightened and motioned for Precht and Warod to follow him, whispering in her ear that he would be back in a little while. They complied, and the three mages soon entered Mavis's office. The clone put a hand on the desk behind him and pulsed his chakra after observing the three men enter and shut the door behind them. As the silencing seals went into effect, the room appeared to flash a bright white for a brief moment before returning to its previous state. The ninja's serious and uncharacteristic behavior caused the three mages to exchange anxious looks. When none of them could explain why, they shrugged to one another and turned to wait for Naruto to begin. He had to wait for their questions to stop before he could say, "So, to begin with, I'm a clone. The real me is with Mavis right now while she recovers. We're currently on Tenryujima in Mavis and Zera's old house. I've been providing upkeep for it in case we ever needed to use it as a safe house. Anyway, I had to apply a seal to Mavis in order to contain an extremely dangerous magic that would otherwise be expelled from her body unchecked and threaten those around her. The process is extremely draining, so she's currently sleeping off its effects under the real me's watch." Precht raised an eyebrow and said, "What magic does she have that's so dangerous it required you to contain it? I take it you remember the man who taught the five of you magic when you first arrived in Magnolia 10 years ago?" Warod verified, "You said that was Zareth, right?" "Exactly. Anyway, from what Mavis has told me, you were unable to approach him because his magic would sporadically release itself and kill every living thing in a predetermined radius, is that correct?" "Yeah, once while he was carving a diagram into a tree, all of a sudden the whole thing turned this dark ugly gray and the leaves shriveled up and turned to dust." Yuri clarified. After giving it some thought, he blurted out, "You're saying Mavis is gonna go around killing shit on accident when her magic explodes?" The other two former treasure seekers were equally startled by this realization and glanced at the clone for confirmation. He gave the three a nod, but before they could object, he gave more details. "It's called the Curse of Anksarum, or the Contradictory Curse. The less one values human life, the easier it is to control, and vice versa. So obviously, Mavis being Mavis, would find it incredibly hard to control the curse. Luckily I'd already been working on a way to stop it so that it'd be easier to fight Zareth." He continued as they appeared perplexed. "It's hard to fight someone who causes your brain to hemorrhage whenever you get within 30 feet of him, you know." The clone's direct declaration of the effects of the curse stunned the mages. Were people's brains bleeding because of sweet little Mavis? They were in disbelief. Precht inquired, "How did she come to be cursed with this? How long has she had it?" He informed them that the curse comes from messing with dark magic. They appeared perplexed. At what point in time had Mavis experimented with dark magic? As he explained, law is a dark magic. Before Mavis modified it, law was a spell designed to rip the soul from a person's body. I doubt Zareth took the time to explain that to her when he was teaching it, but suffice to say that you're extremely lucky that it was incomplete when she tried to use it on you, Yuri. All three of the mages appeared pale, but Yuri's face had completely lost its color. "But wait," Warod replied. "If she's had this curse for the last decade, why is it only now becoming a problem? Judging from what Zareth said earlier and what I already know of the curse, it seems like losing Zera followed by the war soon after, led to a shift in Mavis' way of thinking. My only guess is that she was worse off than any of us thought, and as such, the curse saw no reason to activate. But now that she's finally recovering, it's beginning to manifest itself. It doesn't help that she's completely aware of it now. It's become something of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Since she learned about it this afternoon, it's gone off twice." Each of them took a moment to process the information. Yuri caught everyone's attention by saying, "Wait." Precht and Warod appeared surprised by Yuri's conclusion and turned to the clone to get confirmation. "You said you talked to Zareth earlier. He was here?" they asked. "He and Mavis apparently stumbled upon each other in the forest a good ways out of town, and then I stumbled upon them a few minutes into their conversation. From there, Zareth told us a few things that I already knew, and confirmed even more that I'd already suspected. Which brings me to my next point. Mavis is immortal." Warod, Yuri, and Precht just gazed at the clone. The office was silent for a minute before three "what?" were heard at the same time. The first to fully recover was Precht. He appeared astonished at the idea of eternal life. "She's immortal? As in she will never die of old age? Or she can't be killed at all, like you?" he asked. To a greater extent than when he had discovered Naruto's. Most likely because Mavis had used magic to attain it, while Naruto's immortality was something he could not fathom. Naruto awkwardly scratched the back of his head. With all the conviction he could muster, he concluded, "Well, I'd say she's more like Zareth than me, considering their immortality spans from the same curse, but in essence, she is like both myself and Zareth in that she cannot be killed at all. Or at least, that is the assumption that we are making with the information we have. In truth, there would be no safe way to test it without the possibility of putting Mavis' life in danger, and I refuse to do that." The three men in front of him nodded in agreement. Warod remarked, It really is amazing if you think about it. The others stared at him, wondering what he was discussing. I mean the fact that in the span of little more than a year, Mavis would meet the only two immortal men in the world, and then become immortal herself a short time later. It's a hell of a coincidence, don't you think? After giving it some thought, the other men concurred. After a moment, Yuri laughed. He wiggled his eyebrows at Precht and Warod, making them laugh, while Naruto just stood there looking perplexed. If I didn't know her any better, I'd have said she'd meant for this to happen. What? One final laugh escaped Warod's throat. Nothing, Naruto. Don't worry about it. All the clone did was roll his eyes. Once he had their undivided attention, he went on, moving on. There's just one more thing I need to talk to you about before you can go back to fawning over little Makarov. He waved a hand to stop them from protesting, saying, Mavis and the real me won't be returning to the mainland for the next year or so. The seal I designed has one flaw in that I have no idea how much of Mavis' cursed magic it can hold without becoming unstable and imploding. He once more observed their pale faces. I don't mean that Mavis herself will explode, it's just that the magic that had been built up inside the seal could rupture the containment mechanism and release itself at an inopportune time, which could endanger everyone in the guild. Once we know how long the seal can hold the magic for, we can set up a schedule for when to release it so that it's away from civilization. Does that make sense? Although the three men could understand his logic, they were not pleased with it. With their guild master gone for a whole year, what on earth were they supposed to do? Naruto spoke up once more, as though he could read their thoughts. The man appeared taken aback but profoundly honored by his appointment. In the meantime, Mavis has asked me to appoint Precht as the interim guild master until she can return. There's no need for me to tell you all that what we've talked about today is not to leave this room. The only thing that we were doing in here was discussing Precht's appointment to interim master. Got it? The clone replied with a serious nod. Good. Yuri, I'll be sure to pass along your and Rita's wish for her to become Makarov's godmother. I'm sure she'll be delighted. He approached the three men in front of him and shook their hands. Just because the real me will be staying on the island with Mavis, doesn't mean you can go destroying the guild's reputation while we're gone. I'll be sending clones to check up on the place periodically and to grab supplies as needed. And if you ever need anything, you know where the Kanai are. He looked them in the eyes. The man swallowed and shook his head, saying, that doesn't mean you can take every opportunity to play some dumbass joke, Warod? The clone sighed and held up a hand, saying, good. Remember, they're for emergencies only. The man pouted and said, no Yuri, stripper. Grams do not qualify as an emergency. The three men shook their heads and said, you're married with a kid. Get over it. Any more questions? All right, I've got to gather a few things to take back with me, so I'll leave you to it. Precht halted the mages before they could reach the door as they turned to go. What do we tell the guild about Mavis making me master? Naruto thought about it. Just tell them that she's taking a leave of absence to search for the fairies. That should satisfy anyone who asks. Warod and Yuri laughed, and Precht nodded his agreement. All right, replied the new master. We'll go inform the guild now. Warod said one final thing before they departed. Tell her we'll miss her. It won't be the same without you two around. He waved jokingly and Yuri shined out of the office and headed for Mavis's house on the edge of Magnolia. I'll let her know. See you guys around. He packed everything he believed she might require, sealed it, and left for Tenryjima. The following morning, Mavis awoke to sounds and sights she had been dreaming about for years. She was in bed with Naruto now, and the pain in her bones that had pulled her from the land of dreams was swiftly pushed to the back of her mind. It appeared as though she was wearing one of his shirts, which hung off her body similarly to how one of his cloaks did. She was curled up to his side, her head resting on his chest, while he lay on his back with an arm wrapped around her shoulders. The pain was starting to come back, and she couldn't quite recall how or why they had ended up this way, so she closed her eyes and fell back asleep to avoid it. The man's attempt to move out from under her as smoothly as possible was the reason she woke up the next time. She took hold of his shirt and held on tight to prevent him from moving without opening her eyes. She quickly realized where she was and who was beneath her because her brain was functioning more quickly than it had earlier in the morning. She was going to make the most of this for the time being because she didn't know when she would be able to enjoy it again. Naruto gave up on trying to get away as he felt her hold tighten on his shirt. How are you feeling? He asked, instead, as he started to run his fingers through her hair. At first, she remained silent, enjoying the sensation of having her hair played with. At last, she turned her head so she could look him in the eye and press her chin into his pectoral. She gave him a slight frown in response. Honestly, I feel like death warmed over. Every part of me hurts in some way or another and I feel weaker than I have since I started learning illusion magic when I was 8. Naruto shot her a pitying glance. That's all to be expected. If I understand it correctly, the black magic wasn't just in your magical container. It was spread out through your entire body, just waiting to escape. As such, the seal didn't just take the magic from your container, but literally ripped it away from other parts of your body where it had taken root. As for feeling weaker, it'll be a temporary feeling. Your body is just used to functioning with significantly more magic than is currently inside of you. You're an extremely powerful mage with ridiculous amounts of magic. The amount that the seal is taking away may be enough for you to feel it, but it shouldn't be enough to affect more than your endurance, and even that can be fixed through training. Mavis wished he had brought up the whole ripping magic out of your bones, muscles, and organs before she accepted the seal, but she reasoned that it was too late. Time was the only thing that could make her feel better right now. She hoped he was correct and the lack of endurance wasn't as severe as she had assumed. If this foolish curse caused her to lose the majority of her magic, it would be disastrous. Damn it, she had put in a lot of effort to get to where she was. She could not allow herself to be affected by this. She wasn't weak, in her modest opinion, at least, she was the master of the greatest guild in the world. If she simply gave up at the first hint of trouble, she wouldn't deserve that title. No, she had a year on this island with Naruto to rehabilitate herself to the point where she could once again claim the title of Master. And Naruto was the one person who could help her regain her strength. For his part, the man merely observed the various expressions as they unfolded across her face, much like a film. Anger, concern, resigned acceptance, irritation, and steely resolve came next. As the final look crossed her face, she refocused on Naruto. She said, "You're going to help me train so that I can get back to my old strength. No. Stronger than I was before. I won't let this curse be the end of me. If I give up now, it would bring shame to all of Fairy Tail. What kind of master lets something as mundane and trivial as the curse of Onxarum keep them from doing their best to protect their guild? I'll tell you what kind, quitters, and I'm not, nor will I ever be, a quitter." Naruto was powerless to stop it. He made a valiant effort to contain his laughter at the thought. Unfortunately, he didn't succeed. He snorted with amusement before bursting into fits of laughter. Mavis's angry expression at his laughter only made him laugh more, until tears of joy ran down his cheeks. In an attempt to stop Naruto, Mavis, who appeared extremely offended, started slapping at his chest. She decided it was time for a change of pace when it did nothing but make him laugh even more. She forced herself to get on all fours and straddled his chest, ignoring the pain that was shooting through her body. She quickly covered his mouth with one hand and plugged his nose with the other, hoping that when he realized he was having trouble breathing, he would stop laughing. Unfortunately, it was not to be, as Naruto bit the hand that was covering his mouth lightly. When she withdrew it, he grabbed both of her arms by the wrists and raised them above his head. As a result, his laughter subsided into faint giggles and her body hung inches above his. Suddenly, Mavis had no idea why she had been upset. Mavis felt a shock go through her as she looked down at the man below her, and Naruto just stared back with a big smile on his face. She was no longer able to contain it. He was practically pleading for it, so come on. She gathered all her courage and leaned down the few inches that separated them, pressing her lips to his in a passionate kiss. When she thought of Naruto, the spark that always seemed to ignite in her chest suddenly exploded into a massive blaze that threatened to devour her very soul. Just by putting his lips to hers, he could evoke such powerful emotions in her. She had never been happier in her life. "I'm thrilled to be here right now." In the back of her mind, she realized that the seal must be functioning because, although the curse had not yet been applied, she was capable of exploding with love and affection for the man she was kissing. But Mavis was able to notice one crucial detail through the fog of intense desire. He wasn't kissing her back. She pulled away from the blonde's face and opened her eyes as that thought abruptly ended the kiss. If she hadn't been so upset, the scene that met her eyes would have been hilarious. Naruto's body was stiff and his eyes were wide as he stared at her. She became aware that the hold on her wrists had tightened and was beginning to hurt. She pulled and pulled until he got the hint and released his hold, allowing her to sit up straight again. She followed suit as he lowered his hands to the side. They kept staring at one another until Mavis lost patience, pushed herself away from him, and got out of bed. Then she felt the full force of the pain. She let out a cry as she collapsed to the ground after her legs gave way. Naruto appeared to be startled out of his reverie by her yell, and he leapt from the bed to grab her before she could hit the uneven stone floor. He said to her in a tone that was a little critical, "You're still hurt." He put her back in bed and wrapped the covers around her, saying, "You need bed rest for the next few days, at least." He sat down on the edge of the bed, gazed at her, and sighed wearily. Mavis was leaning back against the headboard, gazing at her hands in her lap. Her bangs obscured her eyes as her hands tinkled with the tattered quilt. She croaked out, not taking her eyes off her lap, "I'm sorry." Naruto gave her leg a reassuring squeeze from above the quilt. "Don't be sorry, Mavis. You did nothing wrong. You just took me by surprise is all. It's been, well, a very, very long time since anyone has kissed me, and you've done it twice in less than 24 hours now. I suppose I just wasn't ready for it." He cracked a smile. His eyes clouded as he reflected on the past. "You know, the only other person I've ever kissed was my wife back when the ninja villages were still around. She was the most beautiful and loving person I'd." "Stop," Mavis screamed, cutting his story short before it could begin. Naruto scowled. "Mavis, it might not be what you wanted to hear, but I'm trying to explain why things are the way they are. Yes, I was married. Yes, I had children. Yes, I loved them dearly, I still do." "No," she exclaimed, looking up from her lap at last. Her eyes blazed with determination once more. "You can't talk about that yet. I still haven't guessed how old you are." Naruto wasn't prepared for that. What the hell does that have to do with anything?" "It has everything to do with this. Don't you remember? The very first time that we met, right outside this room, you said that you would only tell me about your early life in a ninja village once I guessed how old you are." Naruto had a disbelieving expression. "Mavis, I'm trying to open myself up to you right now. Can we forget the stupid game for 5 minutes?" "No," she yelled. "It's not stupid, and you can't just forget it. Just give me one chance to guess your age. That's all I want. It wouldn't be right otherwise." With a hand running through his hair, making it stand out even more than usual, Naruto got out of bed and started to pace back and forth. She replied in the affirmative, and he sighed. "Fine," he said, "one guess. But whether you get it right or not, I'm going to tell you what I want to tell you. Got it?" He looked directly at her and waited for her to make a guess, saying, "Okay, go ahead and guess. Make it count." "You're 937 years young," she stated without a trace of hesitation. "Nope," was his casual response. "I'm most certainly not Nin." "Wait, what did you say?" With a contented grin, Mavis tilted her head toward the shell that startled Naruto. "I said that you are 937 years young." Naruto stammered. How the hell did you guess that?" The answer was, "That's easy," Mavis said. "I didn't guess. I know how old you are for years now. I worked it out through logical deduction based on various stories that you told me and some extracurricular research on the history of the ninja villages. If you knew, then why didn't you say anything? Why did you keep guessing the wrong age each time?" Mavis quickly sobered after her smirk vanished. She said, "I didn't want you to resent me. I wanted to wait until you were ready to open up to me. If I had tried to force you to talk about yourself, it would have just pushed you away. I don't think I could stand it if you hated me, so I decided to wait until you came to me. Obviously my patience is being rewarded." She smiled at him. "I'm not upset that you were married. I'd always assumed you'd been married at least once before. I was never under the delusion that I'd be your first anything. I'm more surprised that you haven't been with anyone else since your wife died. That level of commitment is laudable." Naruto repositioned himself on the bed's edge. "It wasn't commitment that kept me from marrying again," he said. "Don't get me wrong, I loved and still love Hinata with all of my heart. Before I met you and Zira, the only thing that kept me going was the thought of her. However, the pain I felt when she passed away is something I don't want to ever go through again. It was terrible enough to watch my friends die one by one, but seeing Hinata age and begin to fade in front of my eyes was the most agonizing thing I've ever gone through. I've never wanted to die as much as I did on the day I buried her. Therefore, don't give me credit for remaining faithful to my wife over the years. I'm a coward. I let my fears control me for centuries while I fled from them. In order to avoid having to watch my children age and pass away while I remained young indefinitely, I staged my own death. In the mountains, I lived by myself. I came to the conclusion that I couldn't be saddened by the death of friends or loved ones if I had none. I refrained from eating, drinking, and talking. I just slept and trained. I tried to kill myself a few dozen times. Every couple of years, I thought I had figured out how to end my life. I drank only the most deadly poisons for 2 weeks straight, disemboweled myself, and at one point, I even cut my own head off. It didn't work. Nothing ever worked. The poisons didn't do anything, and my intestines would just crawl back inside of me before my skin would stitch itself shut. I still don't know how my head got back on my body. After I cut it off, everything turned black, and when I woke up, I was covered in blood. The ninjas had all but destroyed themselves by the time I emerged from my hiding spot. Fearing for their lives, the few remaining people who could still mold chakra were driven from their homes. Before things began to change, there may have been 50 years of peace after they were gone. He explained to her that he had a talent known as Sage Mode, which enables him to absorb the energy found in nature and use it to increase his power exponentially. When I was younger, it gave me better chakra control, which made it easier to execute my techniques. Now, I can hit and be hit much harder than usual. This is mostly just speculation on my part, but seeing as I'm the only one around now who was able to observe the shift, I like to think I know what I'm talking about. Chakra, if you didn't know, is the combination of physical and spiritual energy inside of a person's body. It's the life force that keeps your heart pumping and your brain working. As such, expelling it to perform jutsus could be extremely dangerous. If you ran out of chakra, you would die. There were signs beforehand to warn you when you were low on chakra. Your heart rate would slow, it would become nearly impossible to move, and organs would begin to shut down in increasing order of importance. But if you used it all at once, or chose to ignore and push past the warnings your body would give you, it would be quite simple for you to kill yourself. Mavis felt both amazed and deeply unsettled by the flood of information Naruto was giving her. All of this information, especially without any prompting, was beyond her wildest expectations. For heaven's sake, she was studying the history of magic. She was getting a first-hand account from someone who was there, while scholars were still debating the origins of magic. Then, however, his people used this chakra. Which kind of barbarians would turn their own life force into weapons to murder one another? When Naruto went on, she snapped back to reality. So without people able to use chakra, there was an imbalance. Humans had lost a vital way to defend themselves from each other as well as nature. My theory is that, once the last of the ninjas died out, nature stepped in and through the process of evolution, adapted the human body to passively absorb natural chakra in a similar way to what I do with Sage Mode. However, because it is done passively and over an extended period of time, as opposed to Sage Mode which takes less than a minute, the effects that I'm granted are diluted in the rest of the population. My body essentially becomes harder than steel, while yours simply becomes more durable, able to take blows that would cripple the average person and shake them off with little issue. I'm granted an immensely accurate sensor ability, and stronger mages gain the ability to sense the magic in those around them, even to the point of determining their affinity. I can more easily mold my chakra, while you gain the ability to manipulate it in the first place. And because none of this requires the use of your own life force, its magnitude's more safe than ninjas using their own chakra. Does that all make sense? Mavis nodded her head absently and gaped a little dumbly. She said, "Can you show me?" "Show you?" As she explained, Sage Mode. He closed his eyes and remained motionless for about 15 seconds, saying, "Oh yeah, sure thing." When he was done, he opened his eyes and turned to face the girl who was confined to her bed. Mavis let out a gasp. His once deep cerulean eyes had turned a brilliant gold. His pupils had changed into broad, horizontal bars that looked like goats, or maybe. She began when Naruto said, "A toad. I used to summon talking toads to assist me in battle. They're the ones who taught me how to absorb natural chakra, and because I learned it in their homeland, where their presence saturated the very air around them, my own features adapted to resemble them." Mavis was in awe. She had never seen anything like it before. She couldn't think of anything else to compare it to except take over magic. Even so, it was a bad analogy. The abilities he acquired seemed to be far superior to even the most potent take overs she had come across, but the physical changes were at best slight. "So you're super strong when you're like this?" she inquired. She desired to witness it firsthand. Naruto gave a nod. After she agreed, he got up and moved to the foot of the bed. "Yeah, I'll give you a quick example, but then I'm going back to talking. I've gotten way off topic from what I'd wanted to talk to you about." Without exerting any effort, he bent down, grabbed one of the legs, and used one hand to raise the entire bed almost 5 feet off the ground. Carefully putting the bed down, he wiped his hands on his trousers before returning to his chair. Mavis muttered, "That's amazing. It's no wonder you hid your identity during the war. If the council had found out that all of that power belonged to one man, they'd have had you arrested or killed on the spot. You could have fought that entire war by yourself, couldn't you? Even if numbers became an issue, you could probably make enough clones to outnumber the enemy forces without breaking a sweat." Naruto shrugged modestly. "I suppose. It isn't something I would enjoy though. It was bad enough killing all of the people that I did under the different disguises. If I'd had to fight the whole army by myself, I'd probably give up just so I didn't have to end all those people's lives for something as stupid as trade rights." Mavis squeezed at his hand. "I understand. It was bad enough sending so many people to their deaths from the command tents. I don't know what I would have done if I was out on the front lines like you and the boys were." Naruto said, "Yeah," before coughing. "We should get back on topic. I think, before you decide that you want to go around kissing me all the time, that I should tell you about myself. I realize that I've been unfair to you in that I know nearly all there is to know about you, and you know next to nothing about some of the most important years of my life. He took a moment to reflect. I think I'll send a clone to go get snacks, because we might be here a while. He started after they both settled in. He told her everything, including how he was raised alone as an orphan from birth, how the village rejected him for no apparent reason, and how the third Hokage fed him ramen. He told her how he went to the academy, was the last person to die, failed the graduation exam, and discovered why the villagers despised him. He described to her the Kyuubi, the sentient mass of chakra he had once contained within himself. Even though the fox's consciousness had long since faded, he showed her the seal that was still on his stomach. When she said that they now matched, Naruto laughed. He described the different challenges he had to overcome to gain the village's acceptance. He told her about how God destroyed it and how he overcame that God. She became aware of both the Fourth Great Shinobi War and its prelude. Battling the dead, collaborating with former Hokages, including his own father, and ultimately preventing the world from being enslaved by a crazy goddess. Sealing himself with the last of the Biju. He lost his right arm after fighting his best friend over the future of their village. He expressed his belief that his immortality was due to the power of all 9 Biju, the first Hokage's cells used to rebuild his arm, and the fabled longevity of the Uzumaki clan. After listening to his opinions on the matter, she had to concur that the combination of those factors appeared to be the most plausible explanation for his predicament. He continued with tales of his spouse, Hinata, and their 2 children, Himawari and Boruto. As he spoke, he raised his shirt, opened a storage seal above his heart, which made Mavis grin a little at the symbolism, and produced a set of photographs that were remarkably intact for being more than 900 years old. However, Naruto simply laughed when she told him that, then reached back to his chest and took out a canister that held an entire roll of film. He then went on to name his wife and kids, along with some of the friends he had mentioned earlier in his story, saying, I managed to wear the pictures out pretty quickly, so I keep the negatives to reprint them whenever I need to. Naruto's descriptions of his family were the most expressive she had ever seen him. As he thought back, she could almost feel the love radiating from him in waves. She was astounded by Hinata's beauty after seeing the photos. Together with her curvaceous figure, her deep blue hair and strangely pearlescent eyes, which Naruto told her were a dujutsu, or as she would call it, eye magic, that allowed her to see nearly 360 degrees at once, created an incredibly alluring image. It was also not surprising that Naruto fell in love with her if she was as loving and kind as he claimed. She felt both sadness and guilt at the same time. What qualities did she possess that Hinata did not? She was not curvaceous or tall, and she was incapable of bearing him children. The elegant and flawless woman in the photos was far superior to her. She was also attempting to take Naruto away from her. Hinata was attempting to invade Naruto's territory. However, she was unable to resist. She simply. Hey. Mavis looked up at Naruto after feeling his hand on her head. Stop it. I know what you're doing, and you need to stop now. She may have been the person that I loved most in the world, but she's dead. I've accepted that. It still hurts sometimes, but I think this has helped a lot. And just because I love her, doesn't mean she's the only woman I'll ever love. She appeared optimistic about this. The blonde's face gleamed as she said, I do love you, Mavis. In desperation, her face fell. I don't think it's the kind of love that you're looking for, she said. But there's no telling what time will bring. That's all I'm asking for, Mavis. Just time to get used to the idea, okay? It's been 850 years since I've tried to love anyone the way you want me to love you. I'll need a while to reacquaint myself with the idea. By the time his monologue ended, Mavis had controlled her expression to one of mild optimism. She said, I guess I can understand that. Time is the one thing that we have in spades, so if that's all it takes to get you to fall in love with me, then I can exercise a little patience. She cracked a grin. But don't think that means I'm just gonna sit around and wait for you to fall into my lap. No, soon enough you'll come crawling on your knees. Just you wait. Naruto gave the girl a laugh. He looked out the window and saw that the sun was starting to set, so he said, I'll be looking forward to it. They had spent the entire day conversing. I'm gonna go cook us up some dinner. After we eat, you're going to bed. Mavis sighed. Don't give me that look. You need rest. The sooner you're up and about, the sooner we can get to training, she was told. The idea of training with someone as powerful as Naruto seemed to excite her. Mavis spoke in an arrogant manner. She crossed her arms over her chest and lifted her nose, saying, Then what are you waiting for? Go fetch me my supper, boy. If you keep me waiting, you'll be punished severely. Naruto simply shot the blonde a sardonic glance. He smirked as he saw the color fade from her face and said, I'll be sure to remember that when we start training. He walked out of the room, saying, I'll get to work as quickly as possible, Ojou, Sama. Mavis's body took 4 days to fully recover from the pain, and once it did, she immediately demanded that they start training. She refused Naruto's request to wait a few more days to ensure that everything had healed. As a result, Naruto led the girl into a sizable clearing he had made the previous day with a few Doton and Futon jutsus, a few miles from their home. He started outlining their plans for the upcoming year as soon as they got there. Alright. The most important thing that we need to work on is your physical strength. You got the short end of the stick when the curse stopped you from aging so soon into puberty. Mavis sighed and reached for her chest. Naruto let out a sigh. That's not what I meant, and you know it, because your body stopped growing when it did. You're never going to be able to go toe-to-toe with fully grown mages in contests of raw strength. That's going to be your biggest weakness in the future. However, there are a few ways we can go about fixing this. Mavis seemed intrigued by Naruto's breakdown of her skills. We can work on your dodging and endurance to try to outlast any opponent you might face, or we can find a supplemental magic that can help enhance your strength and make opponents worry about getting in close to fight. Mavis appeared to be considering the two options, but Naruto made the decision for her before she could. He grinned at her confused look and said, I don't like doing things in half measures, so we're gonna work on both of them. Endurance and dodging first, because even if you can tank a hit coming at you, you should always try to avoid unnecessary injury. Supplemental magic second, so that just in case you face someone quick enough to reach you, they'll have a nasty surprise waiting for them if they try to fight you close up. If you're small and lightweight and tend to dodge a lot, no opponent is going to think for a second that you're competent in hand combat. And when we're not working on those two things, we're going to work on getting your magic back up to where it was. Mavis was impressed that he had considered all of this through. When she first proposed the idea, she had not anticipated such extensive training. Naruto clapped his hands once and grinned mischievously. All of that should take up most of our time here, so let's get to work. Run 50 laps around the clearing. No stopping. After laughing at Naruto's small joke, Mavis waited for him to tell her what to do. Naruto questioned rhetorically, did I stutter? He appeared irate, and she wasn't used to seeing Naruto look angry, at least not when he was addressing her. Get moving. You're up to 60 laps now. If you don't finish this, then you can expect to go hungry tonight. She let out a sigh, accepted the fact that she was to blame, and started to run. By the end of the day, Mavis had learned that the Naruto she had come to love could actually be one of the most cruel, callous taskmasters she had ever had to deal with. Naruto had told her that her warm-up was over and it was time to start the actual training after she had run 60 laps and collapsed to the ground, wheezing in agony. He told her that he had borrowed this next exercise from his grandmother, who was actually the head of his former village rather than his grandmother. He had her stand at one end of the clearing and he at the other to begin. Dodge everything. Every hit is 50 push-ups. He would then launch balls of compressed wind at her, which were extremely difficult to see and struck like a train. She was familiar with that last section because, at the end of the exercise, she had to perform over 600 push-ups after being struck by them 13 times. The worst part of it all was that she couldn't even use her broken bones as a reason to stop or take a break. Naruto would simply wait 10 seconds for the bone to heal itself before repeating the process whenever the wind spheres broke a bone, which happened almost every time they came into contact. She ate 3 portions of the dinner Naruto had prepared and then shuffled off to her bedroom at 8 o'clock that night to change into pajamas and get into bed. Naruto poked his head in the door after she was comfortable, but before she could fall asleep, she sat and waited for him to say something, too exhausted to even give him a nasty look. After entering the room, Naruto sat down on the side of her bed. He brought a wet washcloth to wipe the worst of the dirt off her face because she was too tired to take a shower that night. He spoke as he did this. I'm really proud of you. You took everything I threw at you and pushed through it. I know it seemed terrible, but everything I had you do today is geared toward making you stronger so that you can protect the guild and everyone in it. As time goes on, this will get easier and easier, and eventually, you'll be able to do everything we did today and hardly break a sweat. He smiled at her and she responded to the gesture in some way. He got up, squeezed her hand, and went to the door. He turned to give her a final smile and said, "Get some sleep. Tomorrow begins bright and early, so be ready." He closed the door behind him and walked out of the room, saying, "Good night, Mavis. I'll see you in the morning." At that moment, Mavis understood that her initial days on the island were her vacation. She spent hours reading one of the hundreds of books she and Zira had stored in the library, or she would just sit in bed and talk to Naruto. It was serene, and it was only now that she realized how much she would miss it, since she was returning to Tenryujima for the first time today. This was the way things would be for the next year, and even though her body was tired and hurting and she knew that there would be pain and suffering soon, She couldn't wait for tomorrow. Because she would be one step closer to Naruto and one step closer to becoming genuinely strong tomorrow. Mavis purposefully disregarded rule number 1 of everything she had learned over the previous 6 months and charged her opponent head on. She leapt to her feet and gave her opponent a spinning back kick as soon as she was within range. The limb abruptly changed from pale smooth skin to a translucent blue substance that weighed 10 times as much as her leg normally did as she released her chambered leg, adding the same amount of force to her attack. Without recoiling, her opponent just watched the leg get closer. The man was suddenly standing inches to the right of where he had been when the leg turned. Battering ram appeared in front of him. After seeing the leg go by his left ear, he grabbed it with his left hand, pulled it down violently, and delivered a devastating right hook to Mavis' stomach. She let go of the method being used to alter her leg as soon as her opponent had grasped it, readying it for the impending counterattack. She swiftly used her crystallization magic to turn the flesh of her abdomen into a diamond hard substance that easily withstood the blow when she saw the fist headed for her stomach. Nevertheless, the force of the blow sent her hurtling back, and she had to execute a skillful acrobatic maneuver to land on her feet. Mavis straightened up and cancelled her technique, giving her opponent a glare that was met with a smile. His words, "That was good." He laughed and shook his hand, which was already healing, saying, "The switch between offense and defense was much smoother this time. And I'm pretty sure I broke a knuckle or two with that punch." Following Naruto out of the clearing and back toward the house to refuel, Mavis said, "Come on, let's grab some lunch." Naruto placed 2 bowls of stew on the table and said to Mavis, "I want to test something later today." He smiled amiably and said, "It's going to be the ultimate test of either your crystallization magic, your immortality, or both." However, Mavis was not particularly comforted by the smile. To the younger blonde, ultimate test of anything sounded very dangerous, but something strong enough to potentially ruin her body, even with the reinforcement of her crystallization magic, was something to be dreaded. She could literally make any part of her body harder than diamonds by using her magic to crystallize it. Even Naruto acknowledged that the methods he employed against her in those instances were only employed when he was actively attempting to kill someone, and there were only a few things he had tried that had even managed to breach her defense thus far. She managed not to tremble as she asked, "What exactly do you mean by ultimate test?" Whether she was immortal or not, she was by no means the world's most pain-tolerant person. "Well," Naruto replied, "I'm going to use one of the techniques that created the most famous, natural, landmarks in my old country. It's essentially designed to be an army killer, but we're going to be using it just on you. If your armor can't hold up, you'll be turned to mush, but if it does hold up, then I sincerely doubt that there would be a single person on the face of the planet, myself included, who could hurt you if you chose to crystallize your entire body." The young woman liked the idea of finding out how durable her armor was, but she was still stuck on one aspect of his speech. "Mush?" she questioned disbelievingly. "You're going to turn me into a fine pulp if this doesn't work?" The what.can.u.do gesture was used by Naruto to raise his hands. He pointed to her right arm and said, "Pretty much, yeah. It's not like you'll have anything to worry about. That arm you're using got cut off not 2 weeks ago. If you can regrow an arm in under an hour, your body will be able to piece itself back together from pudding. Trust me, I once saw Zarif get trampled by one of his own demons. He looked like he belonged in a Jackson Pollock exhibit, but he's still an ever-present thorn in my side, isn't he?" He had a point. Mavis had to concede. No matter how bad the flesh wound was, it wasn't like she would simply collapse and not get back up. However, that part of her brain that was still acting in self-preservation was yelling at her to stop doing this. She was informed by Naruto that after the first 100 years or so, that portion of her brain would disappear. She idly wondered if that part also dealt with shame and reason as she cast a quick glance at the man. It would explain a lot if that were the case. "Some days, I really have to ask myself how it is that I can love you so much," Mavis acknowledged. From the other side of the table, Naruto winked at her. "It's because I'm so awesome. I'm like a planet of awesome whose gravitational field is constantly pulling you towards me." Mavis let out a sigh. He was merely demonstrating her point. In terms of romance, Mavis admitted that everything was going great. Naruto had not yet told her that he loved her, like that, but he was growing more at ease flirting with her, even if it was in his own special way. He had even kissed her once or twice, though she suspected that was out of sympathy because it had only occurred after days in which he had been brutal in training. However, she would accept what she could, and if things continued as they were, she would have him completely enamored by the end of their year on the island. She got up, threw her bowl in the sink, and ate the remainder of her stew. She turned to face Naruto, who was still eating slowly, and said, "Let's go. If we don't do this now, I'll lose my nerve." When Naruto gave her a pitiful pout, She scowled and put her hands on her hips. If you hadn't done such a terrible job of selling this ultimate test to me, I wouldn't be like this. Now come on, she said, making hand gestures as she made her way to the door. As she walked outside, she giggled a little hysterically. Let's go smush me to paste. Following her, Naruto accepted that he would have to go without food for the afternoon. When they arrived at the beach on the opposite side of the island from their house, Mavis turned and smirked as cockily as she could. Let's do this. I'm ready. Gazing at her, Naruto suppressed a chuckle. If you insist. After a few seconds of concentration, his pupils changed into thick horizontal bars and his iris turned gold. He put his hands inside the snake seal after entering sage mode. He whispered, Senpo Mokuton. Shin Susenju. Trees started to fall over and the ground started to tremble. A wooden object began to emerge as the sand and earth split apart. The first recognizable feature to appear were hands, then long, curved arms, and a huge head that resembled a laughing Buddha. More hands, a torso, and finally thick wooden legs sitting cross-legged on the crumbling earth beneath it were all revealed as the effigy grew frantically. When it was completed, the enormous structure loomed far above the tops of most trees, with the massive tree in the middle of the island barely overshadowing it. Mavis stared incredulously at the method before her. It was enormous, the hands, too. If the name was any indication, there most likely were thousands of them. Indeed, several thousand hands. She shouted, Naruto, to the man standing atop the statue. Her body was shaking and her eyes were wide with fear. I take it back, I don't think I want to do this anymore, she exclaimed. He inserted a finger into his ear and wriggled it around, shouting down to her, What? I can't hear you. Did you say, I can't wait anymore? Mavis thought he wasn't doing this. He was being a jerk, but she knew he could hear her. Help her, because there would be hell to pay if he didn't stop that right now and come down from there. Naruto interrupted her internal tirade. Hey Mavis, she said, raising her gaze, high five. Fuck. This was going to be painful. Just as the first hands struck, she was able to fully crystallize her body by crossing her arms in front of her. She was knocked flat on her back and pushed into the sand by the first blow. She was then pushed deeper into the yielding sand by the subsequent one. Then everything appeared to blend together. Her whole life was reduced to being battered by a chubby, wooden, religious icon abomination. The hands kept attacking, and it went on and on. She was somewhat aware of what was going on in the areas of her body that were crystallized, even though she didn't exactly feel pain there. She could now feel the cracking and weakening of her left arm. As the hairline cracks spread, her entire forearm must have resembled a shattered mirror. The arm suddenly gave, but not in the manner she had anticipated. Still intact, the arm snapped away at the elbow, and one of the Buddha's many hands thrusted into her crystallized face. Now, in addition to being tormented by this enormous statue, she was also, in effect, striking herself. If Naruto discovered that, he would be ecstatic. Then she felt the foot being ground into a fine powder and her left leg snapping off at the knee. Just as her right leg was about to suffer the same fate, everything abruptly stopped. After a further 15 seconds of waiting, she cautiously crystallized her head and opened her eyes. After the attack was over, she was lying in a crater that must have been incredibly wide and close to 100 meters deep. She could feel the seawater seeping back into her hair after being blasted away by the impacting hand's concussive force. Mavis gradually returned her flesh to normal, leaving what was left of her arm and leg crystallized. She didn't mind bleeding out, but she didn't want so much arterial blood to discolor one of her favorite dresses. Getting out was a real pain. Naruto emerged from the crater as she was completing this procedure and examined his work. When he saw Mavis, he whistled softly. He grinned broadly at the girl beneath him, but she just gave him a glare. That's pretty impressive. One arm and one leg separated but still mostly intact. And both were at joints where the crystal is more fragile. The only thing completely destroyed looks to be your left foot, but we can chalk that up to a lucky shot. She sighed and clutched her severed arm when she saw that her glare was ineffective. Naruto gave a shrewd salute and said, Just pick me up so we can go home. And don't forget my leg. It's much easier to reattach limbs than regrow them. Do you mind if we walk back home? There's something I want to talk to you about. Naruto replied. He started walking and elaborated after receiving a nod in response. I've been thinking. Mavis exclaimed, smirking, That's new. Oi, yelled Naruto. All Mavis could do was shrug and say, Uncalled for. Naruto looked down at Mavis, hoping he hadn't offended her in any way. Anyway, like I was saying, I've been thinking. If we're going to start a more, physical relationship, she said, looking very interested now. I think we should work on a way to make you a bit older, at least in appearance. With her eyebrows furrowed in contemplation, Mavis appeared to be thinking about it. Then her expression abruptly changed to one of recognition. Hinata had big breasts. You like big-breasted women. You want me to look older so that you can play with my breasts. Her direct and only partially accurate statement made Naruto blanch and splutter. That's not what I meant, he exclaimed. He clarified after noticing Mavis's incredulous expression. Well, yeah, Hinata had big boobs, and that was awesome, but that's not why I want to make you look older. It's just that no matter how I try to justify it in my mind, the fact is that no matter how old you may be in reality, you're still inhabiting a 13-year-old's body. At any other time, that'd be fine. When we're talking or fighting or just lounging around, I'm doing those things with an adult. Your personality is the most dominant part of you at those times. But when we decide to, he was speechless. Mavis added, make love. Yeah. When we decide to make love, your physical appearance is just as important as your personality, and I'm not sure I can be comfortable if I were to open my eyes and realize I'm technically doing those things with a preteen. Naruto paused here and hoped he hadn't upset her. They tended to avoid discussing Mavis' body because it was a sensitive subject for her, but if she wanted any kind of romantic future with him, this had to be addressed. He gazed down at the girl in his arms, still mutilated. He had waited until now to bring up the topic with her for a reason. She could no longer chase him or flee if she became angry or afraid. Mavis thought for almost 3 minutes before speaking. Naruto gave her a perplexed look and said, "You're doing this all backwards, you know." Mavis' explanation interrupted Naruto as he was about to respond. Usually the man expresses his love for a girl before he declares his intention to sleep with her. It's only proper. Naruto started to respond, but was again interrupted. During your speech, you said, when we sleep together, not if. She smirked mischievously and said, you did it multiple times, so don't try to call it a slip of the tongue. Naruto appeared somewhat embarrassed by being called out in such a direct manner. He was attempting to avoid jumping into a relationship with Mavis at this point. For an immortal, 6 months might seem like a long time, but it was only a few hours. Mavis would eventually discover that. Yes, he was drawn to her. Yes, he wanted to hold her, kiss her, and spend all of his time with her, but good things come to those who wait. That was demonstrated by his marriage to Hinata. The relationship had been developing for over 10 years. He wanted to give it his all, but he couldn't do that until he resolved the unresolved suspicion that she was still a child. What better way to address that than to allow her to grow up, as it were? Naruto paused his stride and met Mavis's gaze, sighing. He paused to inhale deeply before saying, you're right. I am doing this all wrong, aren't I? So let's start this over. I love you, Mavis Vermillion. For her part, Mavis was a little taken aback. She didn't anticipate that he would genuinely say it that way. Although she had been hoping for it, it was only in the back of her mind, a place she reserved for her dreams. She was in disbelief. It was unbelievable. It must have been a dream. She gave him a slap. What the hell, Mavis? That felt real enough, I must say. And his response was typical of him. Perhaps this was not a dream after all. Her supporting arms abruptly disappeared, and she thumped to the ground. Ow. Damn it, Naruto. Why'd you go and do that? Now my ass is going to bruise. You smacked me after I told you I loved you. Why'd you go and do that? Well, I thought that I might have been dreaming, so I needed to make sure that I wasn't, she explained. And you couldn't have pinched yourself? If I pinched myself, my brain could have just told my dream body that it hurt, but if I hurt you, my brain wouldn't know what to think, I think. Naruto's face was palmed. He dismissed the argument with a shake of his head, saying, that seriously made no sense whatsoever. He waited for her to respond before saying, you're not dreaming. I really do love you. Anything. Well, don't you have something you want to tell me? For a moment, Mavis held her chin in contemplation. You're not just saying this to get in my pants, are you? Why the hell would you think that? I told you that you were doing things backwards by saying you wanted to have sex with me before you told me you loved me, and then right after that, you go and tell me that you love me. What's a girl supposed to think? Oh, in fact, that made some sense. No, that's not. I don't. Well, I mean I do. But, I really, he said after gathering his thoughts. Mavis, I'm not saying that I don't want to have sex with you, because I do. Eventually. What I am saying is that I love you and that I want to be in a relationship with you. If that relationship eventually progresses to the point that we have sex, then that's great. Awesome, really. If not, then that's fine too. I've been celibate for nearly 8 centuries, a few more won't kill me. Mavis kept a straight face as she processed everything. After a brief period of silence, she spoke softly. You mean it? You really love me? Like, romantically? The way I love you? Naruto gave a gentle smile and nodded. I do. He dropped to his knees, pulled her back into his arms, and then got back up. Her eyes remained odd, almost reverent, as she gazed at him. She tentatively cupped his cheek with her hand. She extended herself until her lips found his when he didn't object. Naruto was pleasantly taken aback. He had assumed that kissing Hinata would be similar to kissing Mavis. They were kissing like lovers, and he loved them both. Instead, he discovered that they were entirely different. Hinata's fuller lips moved and responded differently than Mavis's thinner, smaller lips. Furthermore, this kiss elicited both similar and distinct emotions. There had been a fierce desire to kiss Hinata, but there had also been a shyness that was almost childlike. The fast, beating heart and fluttering stomach from their first kiss seemed to follow them. However, throughout their marriage, every kiss also evoked fresh, evolving emotions. It was simultaneously new and fresh, familiar and reassuring. However, kissing Mavis evoked an unfathomable sense of gratitude for the woman who had saved him from an eternity of loneliness, as well as a fierce protectiveness that was ironic given her current state. They were excited to be able to do what they had been considering for a long time. Mavis' kiss had none of the shyness from before. She appeared to change the moment her lips met his. She started to move with assurance and certainty. She appeared to know exactly what she wanted and how to get it, but Naruto was fairly certain that she had never kissed anyone else before him. In a lazy dance, her lips moved smoothly against his. They ended their kiss after what seemed like hours but was actually only 10 or 15 seconds, however, not before Mavis was able to insert her tongue into Naruto's mouth and give his own tongue a playful lick in return. As they parted, they enjoyed the satisfaction their kiss had brought, gazing at each other's slightly flushed faces. With the most contented expression on her face, Mavis leaned in and gave him one last quick kiss before sinking into his chest. Let's go home. On the way, tell me more about your idea to make me look older. Naruto set out on their journey once more. First, I think we should work on teaching you transformation magic. In his arms, Mavis twitched. You mean I could have just been transforming myself this entire time? Naruto gave a headshake. Yes and no, you could have transformed yourself, but transformations alone are pretty fragile and require a good bit of concentration. As soon as someone hit you with any real force, or if you forgot to actively hold the transformation, it would dispel. Curious, Mavis said, then how is learning transformation magic going to help me? The transformation is just the first step. Once you can transform, I can work on making it much more practical. I think with the right seals, I can make it near impossible to break the transformation through force, and make it relatively self-sustaining. It'll drain a fair bit of magic, but you wouldn't have to be conscious of the transformation to keep it intact. We'll have to test it out a few times, but I think you should be able to hold the transformation for a good few hours and still be in fighting shape. Mavis had a reverent expression in her eyes by this time. You really think this will work? I'll be able to look the way I'm supposed to, and be taken seriously as a guild master, and go out in public with you without getting weird looks? She was nearing tears at this statement. Naruto's proposal was akin to a miracle. Her greatest desire, aside from being with Naruto, was to be able to express her feelings and appear mature to people around her. The best thing that had ever happened to her was Naruto. Who knew where she would be without him? You'll be able to look however you want, older or younger, taller or shorter, it's up to you. You don't need to look older to be taken seriously, as a guild master or as a person. Everyone who knows you knows what you're capable of, and those who don't will learn the hard way. I don't know about not getting weird looks in public, but if we do get them, it won't be for how you look. As he concluded his remarks and left the forest to enter the clearing that surrounded their home, he grinned down at her. Alight, he instructed, let's get you inside to fix up your limbs, and then, after dinner, we can start on teaching you transformation magic. Sound like a plan? Let's start on transformation magic now, eat dinner, and then work on it some more after that, Mavis countered. I think it might be best if you had all of your limbs before we start practicing. She cuffed both of his ears before backflipping out of his arms and landing on 2 feet. What? You mean these? She asked. Naruto turned to face her and rubbed his head. When did you manage all that, and with no blood? I started after you picked me up the second time and just finished a few minutes ago. As for the blood, I stuck the ends together, connected the 2 crystals, and then dissolved the parts holding back the blood. That left an airtight space for my knee and elbow to grow back. For my foot, I just crystallized small bits of flesh at a time. There was some blood, but I kept it off the both of us. My foots are the only reason it took this long to finish. In fact, she still lacks a couple toes. As impressive as that is, we should still wait for everything to set itself straight before we try any transformations. Naruto continued. Reluctantly, Mavis consented, and they entered. Mavis waited anxiously to learn this new magic, so she rushed dinner a little. They retired to the library to start after they had finished and put the dishes in the sink for later. After 4 hours, Mavis was starting to lose her temper. For any of this to matter, she needed to reach the advanced level and be able to change her height and body shape. Otherwise, no matter how old she made her face look, she would still be short and flat at the end of the day. She had gotten to the intermediate level rather quickly, and she could change her clothes and face however she wanted, but she was still stuck at her towering height of 4 feet 8 inches. She needed to see how it's done, and Naruto was of little assistance. He had gotten the notion about 2 hours prior and had been parading around in the guise of various busty beauties ever since. Talk about adding salt to her wounds. She decided to use her magic and change in order to give it one last try before ending the day. She pouted, crossed her arms over her chest, and froze when the smoke cleared from her vision. Her chest felt softer somehow. She was staring at the exact same spot on the wall from the exact same height as all of her previous attempts. She threw her dress over her head and looked down, her mouth dropping open and her eyes almost popping out of her head, all the while ignoring the fact that Naruto, who is currently cast as Lusty Lady number 7, was still in the room. Her breasts had grown to the size of small oranges in a matter of seconds, a far cry from the size she had been aiming for, but it demonstrated that she was capable of doing it. She turned to face the stunning redhead in the deep blue ball gown and proudly thrust her chest forward, saying, "I did it. Take a look, Naruto. I have breasts." Unconsciously releasing his transformation, Naruto choked on the water he had been drinking and quickly averted his gaze. That's great, Mavis," he said. "Do they look good?" Fortunately, Mavis knew exactly what she was doing. It sounded more like a question, but he had no idea how to react to this circumstance. She pouted and said, "Mo, you're not even looking. You know, this is as much for you as it is for me. If you don't tell me, how am I supposed to know what kind of boobs you like?" Naruto declared, "I'm a guy, without turning around yet, and I like all boobs, big and small. Those are very nice." He cleared his throat. "It's just the way we're made." By the time he finished, Naruto's face was flushed. "They suit you." With a cunning grin, Mavis stalked up behind the shinobi, who was sitting backwards on the couch, without him noticing. She threw her arms around his neck, pressed herself against his back, and leaned in to whisper in his ear, "Just wait. By the time I finish, they will be even more pleasant." At the end, she gave a sensual purr, and that was all it took for Naruto to get up from the couch and leave the room without turning around. Before he did so, he called out to Mavis, "And then they're all yours to do with as you please. I'm going to start working on that seal right now. You enjoy yourself while practicing." He left after saying, "I'll be in my room if you want me. Want to talk to me, that is." When Mavis heard Naruto's door close, she collapsed to the ground and burst out laughing. To be honest, if she could change the size of her chest that much, she couldn't wait to see what he would do when she finished the transformation. She dried her tears of laughter and resumed her work. Naruto was having a very interesting dream in which he was once again lounging on the shores of the Ramen Sea and being spoon-fed by the local Ramenites. However, this time, instead of the usual assortment, all of these women appeared to be tall, slender, big-breasted, and had deep green eyes. They were evenly spaced around him, but one in particular was being particularly friendly with him. She was curled up along his right side, using one hand to gently stroke his chest while the other ran through his hair. Suddenly, the friendly one smirked cruelly, and used the chest to harshly tweak his nipple. As he sat up abruptly, prepared to chastise her, he jerked in surprise and a little pain, only to discover that he was actually in his bed on Tenryjima, not the glorious land of ramen. His disappointment was brief, though, because he looked down to see a slender blonde draped suggestively across his chest, her hand poised over his right nipple, as if ready to repeat her earlier attack. The woman was perfectly proportioned, with large but not too large breasts, a toned and slender waist that flared out into sensual hips, and long, lean legs that tapered off into dainty little feet. She couldn't be real, and that's when it dawned on him. He was torn between protecting his sensitive chest from the woman's deft hands and staring hungrily at the sight that so closely matched his dream. "Mavis?" he asked, half in wonder, half in curiosity. The woman beside him grinned triumphantly. "Are you surprised?" She had a deeper, more melodic voice than he was used to, but it was still unmistakably Mavis's. "I practiced all night," she said. She winked seductively at him and said, "I thought I'd surprise you with the results. Do you like it?" Like it? He loved it. She was stunning. Her beauty was ethereal, yet still entirely Mavis. All of her features were there, just aged to perfection, like a fine wine. Her mouth, nose, and eyes kept their shape, but they were more defined, more womanly. Her jawline had sharpened, drawing a natural line down to her impressive chest. The biggest change, however, was in the way she held herself. Even when she lay down in nothing but a thin negligee, she appeared to be the most self-assured woman Naruto had seen in hundreds of years, if not his entire life. You. It's. He stammered, relying on action to express his feelings about the matter because words were failing him. He leaned down and swiftly planted a passionate kiss on her lips, pressing them together in a desperate attempt to satisfy his hunger. With a gasp, Mavis withdrew after almost a minute, her command of the transformation faltering but controlled as she regained her senses. She put a hand to her lips and giggled distractedly. "I'll take that as a yes then." Naruto told her, You can't go walking around like that all the time." When she gave him a questioning look, he clarified, saying, "We'll never get anything done if I have to watch you doing every little thing looking like that." Although his words were a little ambiguous, the expression on his face was anything but. Mavis blushed profusely at the lustful glance he gave her before rolling away from him and getting out of bed. With a sad expression on her face, she ran a hand through her smooth hair and said, "Then come enjoy the view while I make breakfast, because you won't get to see it again until you finish your seal. It's hard enough keeping this transformation while walking around, let alone while doing anything fun." With a triumphant expression on his face, Naruto replied, "Then I guess it's a good thing I finished the design last night." Mavis's eyes grew wide, and she joyfully hopped up and down. Naruto lost his train of thought as he marveled at the healthy bounce of her plump chest. "After breakfast, we can sit you down and get it drawn on," he concluded. "After that, we can work on acclimating you to moving in that form for the remainder of the day." Mavis gave him a quick kiss on the lips and squealed with excitement before running off to prepare their breakfast. She stumbled into the wall halfway down the hall and tripped over her own feet, but she shrugged it off and walked more slowly to the kitchen. After she left, Naruto laughed a little and started getting ready for the day. He looked out into the empty hallway and grimaced, knowing that this would be the ultimate test of his self-control. Celibacy for 900 years was quickly catching up.
That's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this great story. See you in the next one.